in the silent chambers of forgotten castles, where cold stones whisper secrets to the wind, and portraits hang with eyes that have seen too much. The story of royal daughters unfolds like a fading tapestry, stitched with sorrow, silence, and the heavy breath of duty in the medieval world, where alliances were worth more than affection, and bloodlines meant power, not poetry. The fate of a daughter was sealed, not at birth, but long before, by quills, scratching treaties, and kings whispering lineage through candlelight. Corridors inbreeding was not a sin. It was strategy. Royal houses across Europe interlaced, their bloodlines like braids, believing purity of descent would ensure purity of rule. But blood does not heed the hopes of kings. It flows as it must, and when folded back upon itself, it carries not only heritage, but harm. From Castile to Austria, from the Tudors to the Habsburgs, daughters were born, with crowns on their heads and cracks in their bones, skin too pale to blush, joints too fragile to kneel, minds adrift in fog before their first prayers were whispered. But none of this was spoken aloud, because the body of a princess was not her own. It was a vessel, a symbol, a promise, sealed in gold and veils. So they taught them to smile with broken teeth, to dance even as their knees betrayed them, to sew with trembling hands and write verses they could not always understand. They were praised for their stillness, for their silence being delicate, as if that delicacy was not a symptom, as if it was beauty, not consequence. In great halls hung with tapestries of battles and beasts, these girls sat like ornaments, nodding to suitors who were also cousins, some barely older than them, some with the same grandmother's eyes, and in that endless cycle of cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, blood grew, weary, heavy, twisted within them, like ivy choking the roots of a once great tree. Doctors who knew little spoke of humors, imbalances, spirits, melancholia. They did not speak of chromosomes or mutations. Those words did not yet exist, but the effects were written in the diaries of queens who mourned daughters that failed to thrive, in letters from abbesses who described the trembling hands of noble novices, in the paintings where one eye sat higher than the other, or a chin jutted too sharp beneath a crown, and in the silence between generations where one malformed spine begat another and another, and still they married them off, wrapped in lace and prayer, sent them across mountains and seas to wed their second cousin, or half-brother, to bear children who would bear children who would bear more sorrow. And no one asked daughters what they wished for, because wishes were for peasants, not princesses. So they wished in secret. They wished for breath that did not wheeze, for sleep without seizures for a day, without pain in their hips, or the shame of not bleeding when they should have. They whispered to saints, to stars, to thee, dolls. They kept long after girlhood passed, and when some of them snapped when the burden grew too great, they were called mad, locked in towers or convents, their names scratched from family trees, not because they were loved less, but because they reminded the family of what they had done in pursuit of, legacy of power, of eternal bloodlines that looped until they strangled themselves. And still, the practice continued, because one good match, one strong heir, was worth 10 daughters, lost to deformity or despair. So they lit candles and said masses, and blamed fate, not choice, not blood, not history, but fate. And the royal daughters continued to be born, and to suffer, smiling in portraits that do not show their pain. But if you look closely at the eyes, you will see it, the tilt of a head, not by design, but by necessity. The hands clasped, not in grace, but to hide the tremor. The stiff collars, not for modesty, but to hold a neck that could not hold itself. Behind those eyes Whole lives lived in the shadow of strategy. Daughters who never danced without pain, who learned to write with their left hand when the right curled inwards, who sang in key despite lungs too weak for breath, who bore sons they could not lift and daughters they feared to name because the cycle would begin again, and each girl became both memory and mirror, carrying not just the face of her mother, but the weight of every mistake made in the name of monarchy. And still they were gentle, still they were kind, still they played harps and recited scripture, and walked down aisles on shaking legs to meet the cousin who would become their king, and kiss the ring that sealed their fate. And in quiet hours when no one watched, they wept, not for themselves but for the daughters. They might bear the pain, they might pass the future that looks so much like the past, and so the castles remain the portraits, remain the names, remain written in books of lineage and triumph. But the truth lies in the marrow, in the curve of the spine, beneath the velvet gown, in the sigh, before a vow, in the silence between two heartbeats, where a girl once ped to be more than a strategy, more than a womb, more than a means to a throne. And it is there in that silence that we find them still waiting to be remembered, not as queens or duchesses, but as girls who bore the weight of empires in their blood and their bones. They called them roses of the court, not for their bloom, but for their fragility. Petals bruised by glances, wilting under weightless crowns, in ancient halls where torches flickered like uncertain fates, and footsteps echoed too loud against stone. The daughters of kings and emperors sat, with hands folded, learning how to endure, learning how to disappear without ever vanishing entirely. They were taught that silence was strength, and suffering was sanctity, that a bowed head meant grace, and a closed mouth preserved honor. But no one taught them how to bear the burden of blood twisted upon itself. Inbreeding was not a mistake, it was design, a cruel arithmetic of alliances, drawn in ancestral ink, and signed with trembling hands, generations of unions between uncle and niece, cousin and cousin, father and half-niece, laid a path paved with frail hearts and troubled minds. Every royal daughter born was both miracle and omen, welcomed with trumpets and prayers, and watched for signs of flaw, a turn of the eye too slow, a grip too soft, a silence that stretched too long. They said she was shy, or devout, or delicate, when what they meant was her mind wandered, and her body betrayed her. One shoulder higher than the other, a gait that stumbled without reason, eyes that stared too long at shadows. They dressed her in silk veils, and whispered that she was chosen, touched by God when she wept, without knowing why. The priest said her sorrow was holy, a gift, a burden born from sanctity. But the truth whispered behind curtains, between midwives and handmaids, was different, darker. They knew the patterns, though they never spoke them aloud. The child with the small mouth and the large tongue, the girl who bled too much or not at all, the way their mothers aged fast, and their grandmothers had all died early. They lit candles to saints who never answered, and brewed herbs that did nothing but ease the trembling for a while at night. These daughters dreamed of forests, of running, of nameless faces that did not look like theirs, because they were not reflections of their brothers or fathers or grandfathers. They dreamed of a freedom they had no name for, and awoke with tears on silk pillows they could never explain. They wrote in journals and languages they were not supposed to know, hiding thoughts beneath poems about swans and stars, hoping someone someday would read between the lines and see them not as broken, not as cursed, but simply as girls caught in a pattern older than memory. In some courts, they were married at 12, in others cloistered before their first blood. Prayers whispered over them more often than their own names by the time they were 15. Many, had lost teeth to rot bones, to curvature, eyes to darkness, but still they smiled, and still they sat for portraits, painted to show health and harmony. Though behind the canvas, a mother bit her lip hard enough to bleed, knowing what the painter chose to hide: a crooked wrist, a hollowed cheek, a gaze too far away. Some of these daughters bore sons, and those sons bore kingdoms, but others bore no one, and were buried quietly in nunneries or cold chapels, their names remembered only when the line grew thin, and the family searched its own branches for more blood to repeat the cycle. And through it all, they remained composed, because what else could they be in a world that saw them as vessels, not voices? They learned to kneel, even when their joints screamed to curtsy, even when their backs would not bend to dance, even when their feet swelled with pain. They memorized prayers in Latin and Greek and traced maps of countries they would never visit yet, were expected to rule if their husband died. Their faces adorned coins and tapestries, but their words never made it to ink. Their dreams never carved into history. And in rare moments when one rebelled, when a daughter spoke too loudly or wept too often, she was declared unwell, unfit, unstable, sent to monasteries, or medicated with leeches and mercury, anything to smooth the illusion of control. But still the mothers knew, still the sisters saw, and when they too bore daughters, they watched with dread. The same signs, the same symptoms, the same silence, descending like mist over memory. The scholars of later centuries would name it in scientific terms: recessive genes, congenital disorders, intellectual delay. But in their time, it had only one name: sorrow. And the sorrow was everywhere, woven into lullabies, embroidered into gowns, spoken softly in lullabies, sung over cradles that knew more mourning than mirth. The castles were cold, not only from stone, but from stories too heavy to be told, directly passed instead, in glances, in traditions, in the way no one mentioned the child who did not survive, the winter, or the sister who remained, always upstairs, always restin'. And yet through it, all these daughters endured. They became symbols of patience, of grace, of sorrow, shaped into song. And when they died, the bells tolled as if they had been queens, even when they never ruled, even when they never left their rooms, even when their names were not etched onto the family tree, but instead into the bones of the next girl who would carry their story without knowing it. And the cycle continued, and the candlelight flickered, and the silence returned. Sometimes they whispered to the stone walls, hoping the echoes would carry their voices farther than their feet ever could. They told stories in fragments to the cold air, stories of a different life, of maybe a love that wasn't arranged, or a child who would not cry from birth until silence of their mother's hands before the rings in the duty's hands that once braided hair and stroked cheeks before they trembled from holding too much history. These royal daughters knew things not written in books. They knew how long a look from a court physician lingered before bad news. They knew the meaning of footsteps at dusk, when servants moved quietly, and the castle seemed to hold its breath. They knew that when the Dowager Queen said the girl had a gentle nature, it meant something was wrong with her mind or her bones or her soul. They learned early not to ask questions because no one answered them, or worse, they answered with soft smiles and tighter rules. They learned to speak with their eyes and to listen for meanings hidden in music and in prayers and in the pauses between them. Inbreeding did not come with screams or thunder. It arrived, quietly wrapped in gold. It crept in through bloodlines, disguised as duty, masked as faith and honor. It wore robes and crowns, and carried the seal of approval from the highest bishops. It came in wedding feasts, and baptismal blessings, and left behind women who rocked empty cradles, humming to themselves. They say some daughters had second sight visions that flickered in the candlelight, warnings of deaths that would come too early, of fevers that would rise too high, of sons who would never speak, and daughters who would be born, but not for long. They said these girls were strange, touched by the divine or the devil, depending on the priest. But really they were just observant, born into palaces where patterns repeated like hymns, and generations looked like mirrors, cracked slightly at the edges. They read too much and spoke too little. They held their breath at births and closed their eyes at weddings because they had seen what came after some tried to escape, not physically but inward into dreams and scrolls into music. One princess kept birds and whispered secrets to them because they did not flinch at her stammer. Another painted faces with smiles because she had forgotten how her own felt. Others wrote poems hidden in the seams of their gowns in thread. Only they could read, and when the wind passed through the corridors, it sounded almost like their names echoing in corridors, long after they had been locked away in towers or tombs. The servants remembered them not by their titles, but by the little things. The way one girl hummed before meals, or how another flinched at loud bells the way. They looked at the sky like it was a place they had once lived in. All of this was understood without needing to be said, because saying it would break the illusion, and illusions were all the court. Had they masked tragedy in rituals, grief in velvet ceremonies, and generations of sickness in portraits that smoothed every flaw. There are accounts in old letters and monastery books, careful phrases like she was a quiet soul, or she preferred solitude phrases that meant she had seizures, or could not speak, or died too young to marry. And the painters kept painting, and the composers kept composing songs for weddings that would never happen, and funerals that happened too soon. And the bells rang and rang and rang, and time passed slowly, like ink drying on parchment. And the royal daughters kept arriving, each birth celebrated with wine and dread, each christening both hope and curse. The mothers always knew before the priest said a word. They saw it in the curve of the spine, the paleness of the lips, the way the child did not cry, or cried too much and too long. They prepared the herbs again, the prayers again, the silence again. And as the girl grew, she was kept from the garden, from the sea, from the village, from herself, cloistered not for sin, but for symmetry, to keep the image of perfection from fraying at the edges, to hide the ghosts of ancestry that lingered in the curve of her fingers, or the lilt of her voice. And so history forgot their names, or confused them one for another, because they all wore the same gowns and lived the same fates. Only the date changed and the name of the castle and the country. But the story did not. These daughters existed in the spaces between power, like notes between melodies. They were reminders, not of glory, but of the cost of empire, the toll paid in blood and bone and mind. And yet still, they smiled in portraits. Still they were married off when their hands shook too much to hold a pen. Still they prayed when no one answered. Still they waited for spring, even when their winters never ended. Because what else could they do when the only escape was silence? And even that was sometimes taken from them. And in the stillness of night, their souls wandered into dreams where they were not daughters of kings or pawns of alliances, but simply girls with laughter in their throats and flowers in their hands, running barefoot towards something unnamed, and finally, free. They were told the blood was noble, pure, unbroken, a line that stretched like a silver thread from God through king to daughter. But the thread frayed where no one looked, frayed in the minds that unraveled in silence, in the hands that trembled while pouring wine, and the feet that never danced properly, always. one step behind, and they were told this was just the burden of royalty, a noble sadness, a delicate constitution, but in truth, it was the echo of cousins, marrying cousins of uncles, giving daughters to nephews of generations, building walls of blood, too close together, until even light could not enter the chambers of their minds and the halls of their hearts. The royal daughters bore this weight with veils and practice and carefully taught smiles. They sat still when their limbs ached, when their heads rang with visions, shadows, or simply thoughts they could not put into words, because words were dangerous, too clear, too sharp, too full of possibility. They were taught silence. Instead, how to tilt their heads like their mothers, how to wait like their grandmothers, how to disappear without ever leaving the room. And in these lessons they lost pieces of themselves that no one mourned, because no one saw them go. Inbreeding carved its signature gently across their bodies. Crooked fingers, narrow jaws, eyes that wandered from focus to fog. And still, they were painted as angels, crowned as brides, and given to kings as offerings, not out of love, but to secure borders, to bind treaties, to prevent war by sacrificing daughters who had never seen a battlefield, but knew the cost of peace better than any general. Some of them learned to float above their lives, to drift beyond the tapestries and the lessons and the expectations they built. Inner sanctuaries, gardens behind their eyes, forests in their minds where they could run and scream and be children. Because in the real world, childhood was brief and joy was always suspect. The physicians came with leeches and mercury and prayers. They diagnosed melancholy and vapors and bad humors. And when the girls failed to bloom as they should, they were sent to convents or kept behind thicker walls where their names were spoken. Less often, and then not at all. But some stayed in court, quiet shadows beside their brighter sisters, the ones who laughed more convincingly, or bled more discreetly, or simply looked the part of a queen in waiting. And those others, the quieter ones, embroidered for hours without ever stitching their names into the cloth, because even that small defiance might be discovered. They watched others live, the lives meant for them, and nodded and smiled and blessed the unions and the births and the banquets, even as they disappeared thread by thread from the tapestry of court life. And yet, their presence lingered in the stillness of libraries and the pages left unfinished, in the locket that someone found, generations later, contained a lock of hair, too pale to belong to the reigning queen. They say some of them spoke to ghosts, or became ghosts themselves, wandering the cold wings of forgotten castles, whispering songs that only the wind remembered their minds, frayed like old lace, beautiful and fragile, and coming apart slowly. Over time, they said things that didn't make sense, or said nothing at all, but looked at you like they knew your ending. And sometimes they did. They'd seen so many of the same stories unfold, like plays with different costumes, but the same sorrow. And they remembered every act, even the ones history forgot. And in this remembering, they found power not loud, or royal, or celebrated, but power, still, the power to see truth, even when veiled, the power to endure when no one thanked them, the power to love in secret, and to protect what little of themselves remained unscripted, ungoverned, untouched. Some of them drew maps, not of land, but of memory places inside themselves, where they could breathe, where the blood was not heavy with duty, where their name meant more than a dowry or an heir. And they kept those maps hidden in plain sight, in music, in poetry, in dreams. And when they closed their eyes at night, they traveled there, away from the marble, away from the mirrors, away from the lineage that tied them like knots. and they slept there for a while before the morning called them back to their titles, their dresses, their carefully arranged expressions, and no one knew the journey they had taken. One asked, and that silence too, W, as inheritance, as much a part of the crown as the gold, or the jewels, or the ache behind their eyes when they smiled for the painter again. They were born into rooms heavy, with silence the kind that settles deep in the bones where every step feels like it echoes across centuries. Their cries were muffled behind velvet curtains and prayers, whispered not to gods, but to lineage, to legacy, to the ghostly shadows of ancestors who watched from portraits with eyes too knowing. The royal daughters were cradled in arms that trembled with duty, kissed by lips that feared their fragility, because from the very beginning they bore the marks, not just of royalty, but of repetition. The repetition of names, of bloodlines, of unions, made not for love, but for lines drawn on maps, and crowns placed on heads, already bowed by expectation. They were wrapped in fine linens embroidered by hands that had long since forgotten softness, and placed in cradles carved with histories, too heavy for their tiny chests to hold their lullabies. Were not songs, but whispers of alliances, murmurs of inheritances, the soft rustle of scrolls being unrolled and wills being rewritten. Their wet nurses spoke gently to them in voices more maternal than those of queens, because queens were trained to love from afar, to supervise affection, not offer it freely. And so the girls learned early what it meant to be touched, but not held, cherished, but not known, and adored only when they were quiet. And still, they watched their brothers grow into swords and armor, into roaring voices and confident strides, while they were taught to become silk and shadow, to speak in glances and silence and curtsies, to never outshine a room unless it was through marriage. Their tutors came with books too heavy for their thin wrists, and lessons in Latin and lineage, and the art of bearing discomfort gracefully. They learned to recite names of ancestors, back 10 generations, but never their own desires. They knew the difference between crimson and burgundy, knew how to bow, just enough to show humility, but not too much to suggest servitude. They mastered the smile that meant nothing, the laughter that filled halls but left their eyes untouched. They were promised futures carved from alliances, their destinies wrapped in parchment, sealed with wax and expectation, saw their names written beside men. They had never met men with swollen egos and narrow hearts, men who wanted queens who would not speak too loudly, or think too deeply, or feel too fiercely. But some of the royal daughters did feel, despite everything, despite the teachings and the trappings and the tightly woven myths about nobility and grace and fragility. They felt, and when they did, it came out in odd ways, in sudden bursts of weeping during embroidery, in poems written in the margins of prayer books, in secret meetings with birds who asked nothing of them but song and seed. They began to suspect that the ache behind their ribs was not just theirs, but an inheritance passed down like jewels and madness, like the shape of a nose, or the tendency to dream during sermons. They noticed that their mothers had it too, a kind of far-away look, a quiet that was not peace, but resignation. And in that recognition they found both terror and comfort, because it meant they were not alone, but it also meant there was little escape. Some tried to change things softly. They asked different questions. They lingered in libraries. They wrote letters to sisters, married off to distant courts, letters filled with careful words and secret codes, and sometimes no words at all, just drawings of wings or oceans or keys. Others found solace in music, playing harps with fingers too delicate to ever hold power, or dancing in empty ballrooms when no one watched, letting their bodies remember a time before control, before Expectations before the bloodlines tangled around their minds. Like ivy, some were less quiet. They ran, they climbed trees, they shouted during lessons and were punished, not for their disobedience, but for their unpredictability. Because unpredictability was dangerous in a world built on control, bloodlines that must remain pure. They were given tonics and sermons and long walks with stern governesses who reminded them that sorrow was unseemly and joy was ungracious and questioning was unfeminine. But they questioned anyway in their own ways, even if it was only in thought. And over time, that questioning became a kind of rebellion, a soft rebellion one, that didn't topple thrones, but shifted perspectives, that didn't break chains but loosened them. They started to see that their value was not just in their ability to birth heirs or seal treaties, but in their quiet strength, their endurance, their wisdom born of pain and observation. They knew things no one taught them: how to read a room, how to spot a lie wrapped in compliments, how to comfort a crying servant without making her feel small. And sometimes when the moon was full and the castle still, they gathered in hidden corners and told each other truths they were not supposed to know. They spoke of dreams and fears, and sometimes even love. Not the love they were promised, but the kind they imagined might exist in some other world. And they held those moments close, like stolen jewels, treasures, not meant to be displayed, but carried inside like warmth. In winter, like light in the darkest tower. And in those moments, they were not just daughters or future queens or walking treaties. They were themselves, fully and briefly and completely themselves. They grew older in silence, their voices trained to echo only what others wanted to hear. Their thoughts were folded like linens hidden behind eyes that had seen too much too soon. They learned to walk with poise, even when their knees trembled, to dine gracefully, even when their stomachs churned from the weight of expectations and the too sweet perfume of power. They were adorned with jewels heavy, enough to bruise their collarbones, taught to smile when they were spoken of like commodities, and to nod politely when their worth was weighed against gold and armies. Some bore it like armor, letting the rituals and restrictions become second skin, learning to wield charm as weapon and flattery as shield. They became adept at reading the unspoken, navigating courts with a dancer's grace and a strategist's mind veiled behind the softness expected of them. Others broke slowly under the pressure, their minds fraying at the edges like tapestries pulled too tight. The inbreeding that had tied their bloodlines into knots also wound itself into their minds, bringing with it whispers in the dark, irrational fears, seizures that the physicians could not explain, and moods that shifted like winter seas. They were called melancholic or mad or cursed and tucked away in towers far from view. Their names spoken in hushed tones, as if their illness might be contagious. Their rooms filled with herbs and rosaries and prayers, while outside the world continued to draw alliances and forge wars, as if these daughters were simply footnotes in the annals of history. Some of them were forgotten entirely, their portraits removed, their letters burned, their existence reduced to a name on a birth record and a few lines in a dusty ledger. Others became cautionary tales, told in whispers to younger girls, meant to frighten them into obedience. But even in those who faded from memory, their stories lingered in the marrow of the castles, in the echoes of corridors, where their laughter once danced before it was replaced by silence in their sisters' glances. In the weight of crowns passed down generation to generation, still heavy with the sorrow of those who came before. Not all daughters broke, though some burned bright, refusing to be diminished by the burdens they carried. They studied languages and philosophy behind closed doors, wrote treatises on ethics and medicine under assumed names, and spoke truths that shook courts when they dared to speak at all their strength. was not always dramatic. Sometimes, it was simply survival. Breathing through another day, enduring another ceremony, offering kindness in a world that rarely returned it. And in that endurance, there was power, a kind of sacred defiance against a world that tried to make them ornamental. They learned the names of their ancestors, but also learned how to name themselves, not just as daughter or duchess or wife, but as person, as mind, as heart. They carried scars invisible, but deep marks from the sharp edges of expectations and from the jagged inheritance of inbreeding that left them fragile in body and sometimes in mind, but strong in spirit. They found ways to mend not just themselves, but each other. They stitched hope into the hems of their gowns, into lullabies for younger sisters, and stories told by candlelight. Stories not of kings and battles, but of women who felt and feared and dreamed. And sometimes that was enough to keep them whole. The royal daughters of the medieval world were not all victims nor all heroines. They were complex and quiet and brave in ways history rarely records their lives shaped by forces older than they could name. And sometimes they bent under that weight, but sometimes they stood, and in that standing there was legacy, not the kind etched in stone, but the kind passed from hand to hand, heart to heart. The kind that lives in the knowing glance of a woman who sees another and understands without words. And as the centuries turned and the castles crumbled and the titles lost their meaning, the memory of those daughters remained not in books or monuments, but in the stillness, before a decision, in the quiet strength of those who choose to be soft in a world that rewards hardness, in the courage to ask why, when others accept because, and in the slow, steady unraveling of a tapestry woven with pain and patched with grace. They are there still a thread in the history not just of royalty, but of womanhood, of endurance, of silent revolutions fought behind closed doors with nothing more than a pen, a prayer, a breath. They were born beneath sailing scarf, with angels, their first cries, muffled by velvet tapestries, and the muted breath of servants trained to move in silence. They were weighed, not in pounds, but in alliances, their names inked on scrolls, long before they had learned to speak, names that meant land, peace, power, sometimes war. The royal daughters of the medieval courts arrived into the world not as children, but as symbols. And this burden was stitched into their linens long before they were old enough to wear crowns. They were watched, always, every smile calculated, every tear tucked away. They were meant to embody grace and promise, beauty and piety. They learned their letters with trembling fingers, taught to read scripture and lineage, to write letters in 3 languages, and say little of their own desires, because desires were dangerous things for daughters of kings. Daughters were meant to bind families, not break tradition, and so their curiosity was curbed, their rebellions quietly extinguished, with a glance, a sigh, a locked door. Some tried to escape through study or prayer. Some found solace in gardens or music, letting their thoughts drift with the wind beyond the castle walls, imagining lives, unlived choices, unchosen. And yet even these small freedoms were shadows, because the blood in their veins carried not just privilege, but a poison, invisible, slow, ancient. The inbreeding that had once been praised for preserving divine bloodlines, now whispered through their bodies, leaving behind twisted limbs, trembling hands, eyes that could not focus, minds that frayed before adulthood. Their ailments were called divine curses or mysterious afflictions, but the truth was buried deep in the family trees, in the 2 short branches and 2 tight circles. Physicians offered remedies, leeches, prayers, potions, made from pearl and crushed bone. But none could fix what had been broken in the naming, in the pairing of cousin to cousin uncle to niece, in the belief that purity of blood was worth more than the health of flesh. And so the daughters suffered quietly, sometimes glorified as martyrs, sometimes dismissed as mad. The line between saint and sinner blurred in the flicker of candlelight and the whispers of courtiers. Some spoke to shadows, others wept at invisible wounds. Some smiled serenely while their hands trembled beneath the tablecloths. They were not allowed to scream, only to kneel, only to smile, only to marry, as they were told, and to birth, as they were expected. Some died in childbirth, others in confinement, others in their minds, long before their bodies followed. And those who survived were often hollowed by what they endured, wearing masks, polished by duty and pain. Still others burned with a light that would not be extinguished. These daughters asked questions. They were told not to ask, read books. They were told to fear, wrote poems in the margins of prayer books, and pressed flowers between the pages of treaties. They found each other in glances, across banquet tables, in coded words, passed through embroidery, in the silent acknowledgement of pain, shared and unspoken. They built secret languages, not of rebellion, but of survival, of endurance, of remembering who they were beneath the silk and the silence. Sometimes they were punished for it, banished to convents or distant towers, their names scrubbed from the rolls. But sometimes they endured, and even in silence, their defiance echoed in lullabies and in legends, in the stories told by those who cleaned their rooms and dressed their hair, stories that said she was kind, she was clever, she listened, she saw me. And in those stories, the daughters became more than symbols, more than sufferers. They became real, their laughter etched into the stone, their sorrow soaked into the gardens. They once walked barefoot. Even as queens, they carried the weight of those who came before, and the warning for those who would come after. That bloodlines built on mirrors will crack, that a crown may glitter, but it cuts. That to be born into royalty is not always a gift, and that sometimes the greatest strength is to remain soft in a world that worships iron. They were women before they were daughters, thinkers before they were brides, and in the stillness of night, when no eyes were watching, they whispered truths to the stars, truths that outlived thrones and empires, truths that rest now in bones and dust, but breathe still in every woman who chooses to feel, to ask, to dream, to be. They were born into rooms thick with incense and expectation, the weight of centuries pressing down on the cradle, where they lay, tiny fingers curling in sleep, unaware that their futures were already whispered in council chambers and inked onto marriage contracts. Their first swaddling cloths bore embroidered crests, not for comfort, but for duty. Their lullabies were hymns, their toys, miniature scepters, their dreams shaped by others, long before they could form their own thoughts. And within their blood ran a pattern, too often, repeated names that echoed, generation after generation. Bloodlines curled in on themselves in the name of legacy and divine right. The belief that keeping blood pure preserved power birthed a lineage of daughters whose bodies bore the weight of that choice. They grew in beauty and in silence, hair brushed until it shone, eyes trained to remain, lowered but alert, taught to listen, to obey, to endure. And when their limbs ached without reason, when fevers came in waves, when their hearts beat too fast or too slow, when their minds turned inward, spiraling into fear or confusion, it was seen not as the cost of inbreeding, but as divine punishment or feminine fragility. Their ailments were hidden behind brocade gowns, their episodes explained away with words like melancholy or sacred visions, their suffering a necessary silence. In the greater story of dynasty and rule, no one spoke aloud. The truth that too close blood could twist the body and fog the mind. No one would question the sacred pattern, because to question, it was to question the order of things. And so they endured as their mothers had before them, and their daughters would, after living lives not entirely their own, filled with rituals of beauty and sacrifice their days, scripted like a prayer, repeated endlessly, each hour marked by duty, each glance a performance. But within that rigid world, they carved spaces of their own stolen moments of laughter, shared secrets beneath the ivy walls, friendships formed in the stillness of embroidery halls, or behind the heavy doors. Winter chambers some found solace in tending to herbs, composing secret verses. Some painted hidden images behind altarpieces, or sewed symbols into their gowns, signs of quiet resistance, a language only. They understood others, lost themselves in prayer, not always to find peace, but to escape the noise, the burden, the weight of a name they never chose. And in that deep quiet, they asked questions they were never allowed to voice aloud. What if I had been born into another family? What if my body did not ache without warning? What if my voice could be heard, not just echoed in the mouths of others? And the walls did not answer, but they listened. And perhaps that was enough for a time. These daughters were taught that obedience was virtue, that silence was strength. But their eyes told another story. They carried the memory of other daughters of cousins and sisters and mothers who had not survived, who had slipped into madness, or vanished into cloisters, or faded from the world. Like smoke, their names erased, their stories twisted into cautionary tales. They were told these women had been weak or cursed or defiant, but in the deepest part of themselves, they knew the truth. These women had been consumed by a system that prized blood over breath, tradition over tenderness, control over care. And still they rose with quiet strength, dressing each morning in layers of silk and armor, smiling when their hands trembled, answering to names that never felt like their own. They were not saints, though. Some were canonized. Not ghosts, though. Many lived like shadows. They were girls who became women in locked towers and mirrored halls, whose reflections often frightened them, not because of what they saw, but because of what they didn't see. A self that had been slowly erased and remade into something palatable, something royal. They learned to navigate the currents of court life, the dangers hidden in compliments, the threats wrapped in silk. They mastered the art of saying nothing with grace, and of surviving without surrendering entirely. And for those who couldn't, for those whose minds unraveled, whose bodies failed under the strain, there was no monument, only a whisper, a closed door, a shift in conversation. But the others remembered, and in remembering, they kept each other alive across generations in songs and stories and silent acknowledgments. They created a lineage not of blood, but of resilience, a hidden thread stronger than gold, one woven from endurance, empathy, and the desperate desire to be seen as more than what they were bred to be. They were not merely the daughters of kings. They were witnesses to a truth no one dared to speak, and they carried that truth not with bitterness, but with a quiet grace that echoes, even now in the spaces where history forgot to look. They walked through corridors, heavy with centuries of breath, their footsteps barely echoes among the stones that had borne witness to too many lives, too many secrets. The portraits above them stared with hollow eyes, faces once alive, now preserved in oil and silence. Daughters who had once smiled in painted gardens now hung in rows, solemn symbols of continuity. But behind those carefully rendered eyes lay stories never spoken aloud, dreams left to die in rose gardens, hands once warm, now folded forever in velvet. They were expected to admire these images, to aspire, to join their ranks, to find meaning in being one more face in a gallery of forgotten names. But some felt the weight of those gazes as warnings rather than blessings. They knew the truth that not every daughter survived to become a painting, that many disappeared into the margins of history, their voices swallowed by stone, their sorrow masked by stained glass windows that cast colored light on lives far dimmer than they seemed. They heard the stories whispered by nurses and chambermaids, fragments of truth, tucked between prayers and lullabies. A girl who sang to herself until she no longer spoke, a sister who bled for weeks and was never the same, a cousin locked away for dreaming too loudly. These weren't just cautionary tales. They were reflections, distorted by fear and duty. And in those shadows they found themselves. They weren't always broken, but they were often bent-shaped by expectations that twisted love into obligation and turned curiosity into sin. Their minds became mazes, built for survival thoughts, walled off from sight words, chosen like weapons or shields. They learned when to speak, when to smile, when to be still, and when silence screamed louder than anything they could say. And in that silence, they watched. They watched their mothers age beneath powder and pearls, their sisters fade beneath expectations, their brothers sent away to battle, or study, or scandal, while they remained constant fixtures in a world that rarely asked what they wanted. The weight of inbreeding wasn't just in the blood. It was in the silence, in the repetition, in the relentless erosion of selfhood over generations. It was in the way. No one questioned why illness and instability visited their line with such cruel consistency, why minds unraveled and bodies failed, even as they were praised for their perfection. It was in the way pity and pride coexisted in the eyes of physicians and priests, and it was in the way those daughters learned to carry both shame and sacredness like twin flames. Neither warm enough to comfort, only hot enough to burn, they grew into women behind veils, both literal and unseen. Their beauty, a requirement, their will, an inconvenience, their strength, a secret kept even from themselves. And yet, within the cracks of that world, they planted seeds, not of rebellion, but of remembering small, defiant acts of tenderness and thoughtfulness that history rarely recorded. A whispered prayer for a fallen friend, a stolen book read by moonlight, a moment of laughter behind a tapestry, a letter never sent, but kept folded close. These were their rebellions, their revolutions, not in fire or blood, but in endurance. They became masters of subtlety, of surviving with elegance, of outlasting those who would shape them into myths. They lived lives threaded with quiet complexity. Their stories, not simple tragedies, but intricate weavings of hope and hurt, of longing and legacy. And though many would not be remembered by name, their impact lingered in the air of the chambers they once filled, in the songs sung to daughters generations later, in the wisdom passed down in looks and gestures and unspoken truths. They became the heartbeat beneath the throne, steady even when the crown wavered, their influence uncredited but undeniable. And in time, some found ways to shift the course, to break patterns not loudly, but steadily through choices once denied to them, by learning, by teaching, by insisting on compassion over tradition. They loosened the knots that bound them. They didn't undo the centuries, but they opened doors for those who would come after. And perhaps that is what legacy truly is. Not statues or titles, but the courage to remember the forgotten, the strength to question the sacred, and the will to imagine a life beyond duty. They were born into a world not built for them, yet they shaped it with every breath they chose to keep, breathing with every step they took through gardens and corridors, with every truth they carried in silence. They were the ones who endured not because they had no choice, but because they chose to give meaning to their survival. They were the unnamed architects of gentler futures, the silent keepers of painful knowledge, the true daughters of a history that refused to look them in the eye until now. The castle stood against the gray sky like a clenched fist, its stones damp with the breath of another long winter inside the corridors. Ran cold, the walls exhaling centuries of secrets and sorrow. This was no fairy tale home, but a fortress, built to contain history and hide it to smother truth beneath velvet. And vow the daughters who moved through these halls did so like echoes heard, but not seen, shaped by rituals older than their names, groomed for duties they never chose. Their education was script recited, not lived etiquette before empathy posture, before passion, repetition. In place of revelation, they learned to speak in tones that soothed, to walk without sound, to weep only when alone. They studied maps, not for adventure, but for lineage, memorizing alliances and bloodlines like scripture, because their worth was measured not in who they were, but in whom they might marry, or what womb they might carry forward. The burden of legacy, their bodies were battlegrounds, long before their minds could comprehend it. And though their WS glittered with thread, spun from gold, it did not warm the hollowness within. Inbreeding wasn't just a matter of birth. It was a culture, a theology, a practice sanctified by crown and clergy. It promised purity, but delivered peril, and its victims were often the youngest, the softest, the most silent daughters, born of cousin to cousin, generation to generation, bore the hidden scars from birth, their eyes distant or their hands trembling, their hearts racing without reason, their sleep haunted by things they couldn't name. The midwives knew. Though they said nothing, they recognized the subtle signs. The quiet newborn who never cried, the toddler with eyes too wide and thoughts too tangled, the girl whose mind was a storm she could never still. But still, the rituals continued. Marriage within blood, for the sake of blood politics, made sacred through suffering the church. Blessed unions that fate would curse, and the physicians blessed what they didn't understand. Leeches for melancholy, incense for voices that cried out in empty rooms. The girls learned to pretend to smile through the fog, to repeat their prayers even when the words meant nothing. And they weren't alone in this. Their mothers had worn the same masks, their grandmothers too. They whispered in the night, the warnings and the wisdom to keep breathing, to keep folding the corners of the soul until it fit into the corset of expectation. But there were always those who broke, the ones who couldn't hide the shaking hands or the sudden silences or the laughter that came too loud and too sudden. Some were sent away to convents, others to towers. Some simply vanished, their names crossed out in ledgers, their faces painted over in family portraits, their absence explained away as illness or divine punishment. But their absence lingered like cold beneath the floorboards, and their sisters felt it deeply. It was the fear behind every forced smile, the chill in every arranged meeting, the quiet calculation of every glance from father or uncle or priest. What is wrong with her? They would ask, but they never asked what had been done to her. They never questioned the system, only the symptom. And so the cycle continued. generation after generation, repeating the same mistakes enshrined as tradition. The daughters caught in the middle, knowing too much and allowed to say too little. They turned their pain inward, fashioning their suffering into art, into prayer, into shadow. They found solace where they could, a flower pressed into a book, a melody hummed alone, the soft weight of a cat who asked for nothing and understood everything. And sometimes they found each other, a cousin who held her hand too long in chapel, a sister who whispered back, "In the dark, I see it too. I feel it too." And in those moments, the silence cracked just a little, letting in a sliver of something. Not quite hope, but not despair either. But such cracks could not grow wide. Not yet. The weight of empire was too strong, the expectations too heavy. They were daughters of kings and pawns of nations, and their suffering was sacred. A cost paid for the illusion of control, the illusion of greatness, the illusion of divine right. The walls of the castle didn't care. They had seen it all before they would see it again. And so the daughters learned to walk without leaving marks, to cry without sound, to break in private, and heal in pieces. Because no one would come to save them. They would have to save themselves quietly, slowly, secretly, and they would. And in doing so, they would write a different kind of history. One not told in books or sung in choirs, but etched in the breath. They passed down in the eyes. They shared with future daughters. In the strength they carried like a secret flame, waiting for the day someone would name it. Not madness, not weakness, not shame, but survival. And then everything would begin to change. They sat in the solarium during winters, with shawls over their shoulders and silence between them. Their eyes often distant, watching snowfall like falling time. Some stitched endlessly. Others read passages of scripture without listening to the meaning. One twisted strands of her own hair around her fingers until they turned white from pressure. Another stared at her hands, as if trying to remember which ones were hers. They were daughters of noble houses, kept like rare birds in gilded cages, their lives orchestrated by lineage, their choices made by bloodlines, and the illusion of destiny. Sometimes, when the frost collected thick on the windows, they would speak softly of things unsaid. They spoke in metaphors, not to be overheard. A mirror cracked meant a mother lost in childbirth. A candle burned out too soon meant a sister sent to a convent. Not all the daughters were broken. Outwardly, some walked gracefully. Some learned to sing and recite and perform their role like the finest actors of court. But beneath the facade, there lingered tremors, strange fears, inexplicable anger, sleep that never refreshed, and laughter that echoed wrong. It was the inheritance of inbreeding, not just in body, but in the soul. The genetic web, too tight. The blood, too familiar, minds unraveling, like silk stretched thin from repetition. Their tutors blamed imagination. Their caretakers blamed sin. But the girls blamed themselves because no one else would. The priests offered prayer. The doctors offered nothing. And the fathers offered only more silence. The halls they wandered were haunted, not by ghosts, but by memory. Every room held a whisper of pain, a cry, once muffled a birth, once mourned in secret. The portraits on the walls showed ancestors with familiar eyes and strange gazes, cousins who became parents, uncles who became husbands, legacies born of convenience and cloaked as necessity. The girls learned their history by living its cost. They heard the stories of glory, of crusades and treaties and marriages that shaped kingdoms. But they also heard what was not said, the stutters, the limp, the fits. The girl who swallowed nightshade and was never mentioned again. They grew up believing they were vessels, nothing more, that their value was in purity, and obedience, that their minds were secondary, their dreams irrelevant. And when one would resist, even slightly raise her voice, ask a forbidden question, touch someone with tenderness, she was labeled disobedient, fragile, hysterical. Some were locked away in upper towers, with windows too small for escape, given tinctures to make them sleep, and prayers to keep their soul clean. Their mothers rarely visited. They too had been taught that silence was strength, and compliance was safety. And so the cycle turned, one wheel of gilded sorrow after another. But not all daughters surrendered. Some began to keep diaries hidden beneath loose floorboards, or sewn into hems of gowns. They wrote in code sketches and symbols: a bird with broken wings meant a girl who stopped speaking; a rose without thorns, a girl married off too young, and too soon they mapped their trauma not to relive it, but to resist it in quiet ways. They began to tell each other stories, not of kings and heroes, but of girls like themselves. Clever girls who escaped, who survived, who even thrived in faraway lands where no one asked their bloodline, only their name. These stories became lifelines, passed from girl to girl, whispered in corners, embroidered into linens, passed like seeds, hoping one day they might grow in better soil. And they spoke of love, not the kind arranged in councils and contracts, but the love they found between each other. Hesitant hands, brushing in candlelight, glances held too long behind veils. One girl kissed another in the chapel, once, while praying, and never spoke again, yet remembered it every night until her dying day. These were not just tales, they were rebellions, micro-resistances, carved into ritual and repetition. Every smile that held pain, every dance that masked rage, every lullaby sung to a younger sister to keep nightmares at bay. They were the daughters of kings, yes, but they were also the quiet architects of change, the ones who held the knowledge of what should never be repeated. Their suffering became a kind of archive, a testament to endurance, to the strength of those forced to live inside cages and still imagine flight when storms hit and wars raged and fathers fell from grace. It was often these daughters who held what remained, stitching broken lines of families back together, soothing the mad, the sick, the dying. They did it without recognition, their names, footnotes, their stories silenced. But history remembers in the ways it can, in the gaps between records and the letters never sent, in the rooms where their presence lingers. Still, it remembers in the way a hand trembles while touching a cold stone wall in an old castle. How sometimes a draft carries not just air but ache, and how snow falling in silence can sometimes feel like mourning, because the lives of these daughters were lived, not in grand moments, but in enduring 1,000 quiet violences, and still managing to love, to hope, to breathe. They were meant to disappear into history, as wives and mothers and daughters. But they became something else entirely, the invisible thread, holding centuries together, soul of a lineage, the memory of survival. When a royal daughter reached the age of ripening, as they called it, her world shrank even further. Courtyards became forbidden, forests replaced by embroidered samplers, the open air exchanged for incense-filled chambers. Women with lined faces whispered instructions into her ears: how to walk, how to sit, how to bear sons, how to endure pain without a sound. She was a future, sealed in parchment, her alliances mapped before her first blood, and her fate sealed with signatures. She did not write. The tutors arrived not to teach, but to shape her into a vision, idealized, not a person, but a concept, the pure vessel, the silent wife, the noble ornament. They examined her like livestock, lifted her chin, measured her teeth, commented on the width of hips and the curve of her neck, as if she were an artifact, not a child. Her days were no longer her own mornings, were for posture afternoons for harp and needlework, evenings for scripture and reflection and dreams, if permitted at all, belonged to those who could afford rebellion. Some girls wept in corners, unable to voice the fear of being wed to an uncle or a cousin who smelled of wine and sweat. Others trained their minds into silence, convincing themselves this was duty, that suffering was sacred. Some began to lose themselves, entirely forgetting their names, speaking in borrowed tongues, rehearsed for the benefit of foreign courts. Their identities, replaced by titles. Betrothal was not a moment of joy, but a tolling bell, a signal of departure from the self. A girl became a wife, became a mother, became a shadow. Even the wedding night was spoken of in riddles, an act cloaked in duty. She was reminded to pray before and after, to keep her eyes closed and soul distant, as if disassociation were virtue and shame a holy garment. And for those who bore the children of these matches, the cycle deepened. Each birth, a lottery. Will it live? Will it walk? Will it think? Clearly will it bear the marks of the blood wound? Some were lucky and gave birth to sons who smiled. Others bore children with eyes too far apart, hands that never unclenched, or minds that never woke fully. And in the worst cases, both mother and child were buried within a fortnight, with the priests speaking of God's plan, and never once naming the cause. The court spoke in hushed tones of God's judgment or bad stars. But in the kitchens and among the maids, they called it what? It was the sickness of same blood, mingling again and again, too many branches circling back to root. Some royal daughters began to anticipate the curse. They watched their children grow with apprehension. Every silence, every stumble analyzed for signs. Some wept, not from joy, when their sons cried at birth, but from fear when they didn't. Their lullabies became spells, whispered with trembling lips, prayers woven with desperation. Some tried to flee, not with footsteps, but with mind. One queen in a stone tower refused to speak for 9 years. She painted her room with symbols, waited for the end. They called her mad, and they locked her door tighter. And yet others endured, not out of strength, but because they had no choice. And in their endurance, something terrible and beautiful bloomed: resilience that resembled rot. A strength born of pain, worn like armor beneath silk gowns and gold thread in secret. They wrote letters to each other in ink, made of crushed berries and ash, signed not with names, but with shared symbols. A knot, a rose, a broken wheel. Their letters spoke of sorrow, of children born without breath, of sisters taken to convents for loving wrong, of mothers who died before they could warn, and of hope, slender, fragile hope, that perhaps their daughters might live differently, that perhaps silence was not the only inheritance. And in those rare moments when one daughter found another who understood, they formed bonds deeper than any royal pact. Not lovers always, but something more essential. Mirrors in each other's grief, witnesses to one another's truth. They exchanged glances in crowded halls, touched hands, under tablecloths, sat in gardens, sharing nothing. And everything with only their presence. They were often separated, sent to distant lands, or confined in wings of stone. But memory remained. Memory was rebellion. They remembered the names of the broken and the brave. They remembered the stories, whispered to them by nurses, by maids, by sisters, long dead. They kept them alive by speaking them in their mind again and again, until they were etched like scripture, Some even dared to teach their daughters differently, just a little enough to light a spark beneath the weight of tradition teaching. Them to ask, teaching them. To doubt, teaching them that obedience was not always virtue, and still they paid the price. Daughters silenced, dismissed, cast out, or worse, but not all was lost. Because seeds planted in hidden gardens sometimes find their way to sun. Centuries later, scholars would find those symbols in margins, in embroidery, in carvings on the backs of mirrors, and begin to understand what had been hidden all along the network of pain. The invisible sisterhood, the map of shared survival. They were not mad. They were not broken. They were not merely victims. They were archivists of pain and guardians of truth. Their legacy lives in the way we speak of trauma, in the way we question lineage, in the way we understand the cost of power, not just in blood, but in mind, in soul, in spirit. They are present in every tale that refuses to forget, in every song that mourns what was taken in, every breath that names what was once silenced. They remind us that history is not only written by victors, but also whispered by the voiceless, and that sometimes the most powerful story is the one never meant to be told. Understood. I will now send Part 5.1 of the script, What Inbreeding Did to Royal Daughters in the Medieval History for Sleep, in English, as a monolithic block, no line breaks, no paragraphs, exactly 20 zero characters. Starting now, this message contains the first 10 zero characters, and I will send the second half immediately afterward. In the shadowy halls of medieval Europe's royal courts, where legacy was more important than love, and bloodlines more sacred than beliefs, the fate of royal daughters was sealed long before they ever opened their eyes to the world. Born into gilded cages, they were not daughters, not girls, but strategic assets, weighed and measured not by their intelligence or compassion, but by the clarity of their blood. As alliances needed to be preserved, and empires maintained their continuity, through sacred heritage, kings and queens turned inward to cousins, uncles, and even siblings to ensure that no drop of foreign influence would tarnish their lineage. But such choices came with a price. Behind the embroidered veils and jeweled tiaras were young girls suffering from ailments no physician could cure, trapped in bodies twisted by genetic repetition, their minds clouded by conditions yet unnamed in that era. They were the whispered warnings in family lines, their lives abbreviated or burdened, and yet they continued to be born, generation after generation, not out of cruelty but out of necessity. Royal pride was a double-edged sword, and nowhere was its cost more visible than in the lives of these daughters. In castles carved from stone and pride, silence echoed louder than cries. Many of these girls were cloistered away, not to protect them, but to protect the dynasty from the shame of their affliction. Their stories were rewritten or erased, their names buried in monastic ledgers or footnotes of court documents. And yet, their presence haunted the lineage charts, like ghosts scribbled in ink. From the Habsburg jaw that jutted defiantly from the portraits of queens to the mysterious seizures of the Princess of Navarre, each anomaly carried whispers of unions too close for comfort. Their suffering was not public, not discussed, not understood. It was hidden behind the walls of the nursery, the convent, the infirmary. It is said that Princess Adelheid of Bavaria never spoke a word beyond her 5th birthday, not because she couldn't, but because something inside her dimmed like a candle, snuffed by unseen wind. Her father, a devout man, built a chapel in her name. Her mother simply wept. Adelheid's blood bore the mark of 5 generations of cousin marriage. Her spine was curved, her limbs stiff, her mind trapped in fog. She was not an exception, but part of a pattern that stretched across courts from Castile to Bohemia. In Iberia, royal daughters were known for their beauty, but behind their alabaster skin often lay fragility. Queen Blanca's niece, Infanta Mariana, was confined to her bed for most of her 16 years. Her bones, brittle as sugar glass, broke when she turned in sleep. And thou, Dage poets, praised her angelic stillness. It was not grace, it was pain that kept her still. At royal feasts, these daughters were rarely present, and when they were, they sat in silence, eyes lowered, skin pale, dresses padded to disguise the thinness of their limbs. Chroniclers rarely mention them in detail, referring instead to a quiet sister or the younger daughter who did not marry. Their stories were as muted as their voices. The cost of inbreeding was not immediate, and so it was often ignored. A king might father a robust heir by his niece and declare it a sign of divine favor. But by the second generation, signs appeared: squints that never corrected, jaws that refused to close, minds that never fully opened. Physicians offered leeches and prayers. Midwives whispered warnings. But the dynastic goal outweighed mortal concerns. After all, was it not better to have a sickly pure-blooded princess than a robust daughter from a merchant stock? This was the logic that governed royal nurseries. And so, daughters were born into histories that repeated themselves like cracked hymns, their lullabies sung in minor keys, their fates echoing their mothers and their mothers' mothers. In France, a princess named Eleonore was said to have the voice of an angel. But when she sang, her eyes rolled back and her hands trembled. She died before her 12th birthday, and the court remembered her only as the sweet child with the fits. No one asked why the fits ran through 3 generations. No one dared. Her portraits were stored in the palace attic. Her name was embroidered on an altar cloth. Her life, like that of so many, reduced to a symbol. In the dim halls of learning, monks occasionally noted strange patterns. Brother Theobald, a chronicler in Aachen, once remarked that the daughters of kings suffer the same sorrows as the commoner's goat. He was reprimanded and sent to copy scripture for a year. The crown did not tolerate curiosity, especially not about its own rot. And so the rot spread. Through marriage treaties and dowry negotiations, through papal dispensations and whispered promises, the royal houses ensured that their trees bore fruit only from familiar branches. The idea of love, choice, or even attraction was alien to these unions. Royal daughters were trained not to desire, but to endure. Their silence was their dowry, their obedience the only virtue that mattered. Even when they could think, could speak, could question, they rarely did. For to question was to endanger the fragile architecture of monarchy. In some cases, though, the daughters rebelled. One Spanish princess fled the court on the eve of her betrothal to a cousin. She was found weeks later in a convent, her hair shorn, her feet blistered, her letters burned. She was returned to the palace, married in silence, and bore 6 children, 3 of whom died before the age of 5. Her face disappeared from official records. Her legacy was a line in a genealogy, nothing more. Even in death, their stories remained entangled in politics. Tombstones bore no truths, only titles. Epitaphs spoke of virtue, never of suffering. And in the quiet of crypts beneath cathedrals, the bones of these daughters lie twisted in silence, forgotten by time, but remembered by blood. In the courts of Vienna and Prague, the specter of genetic decay haunted every christening, every engagement feast. Behind every flute of wine, every raised goblet to health and longevity, lurked the question no one dared speak aloud. Would the next daughter be whole, or would she bear the invisible scars of lineage turned inward too long? The Church, so often invoked in matters of marriage and morality, blessed these unions with indulgent prayers and papal bulls. Yet even the clergy could not deny the pattern. Nuns in cloisters whispered among themselves when another young girl arrived with sunken cheeks and distant eyes, sent by royal decree to live out her days in service and silence. These were not saints, they were symptoms. In the East, in the glittering courts of Hungary, a princess named Cataline was born with a heart that beat unevenly. By the age of 6, She would faint at the sound of bells. By 10, she could no longer walk unassisted. Her father, proud and stubborn, declared it a test from God. Her mother wept behind closed doors. The court called her Catalin the Pale, and when she died, her name was carved onto a small wooden plaque, tucked beneath a stained glass window no one visited. Her story, like those of so many others, dissolved into legend, half remembered by servants and scribes who dared not write too much. Sometimes the signs of inbreeding were subtle: a slight delay in speech, a nervous twitch, a fear of light, or loud sounds. Other times, they were grotesquely clear: elongated jaws, cleft palates, extra digits, or cruelly shortened lives. Physicians tried to treat these afflictions with herbs, prayers, and mercury. Nothing worked, because the affliction was, and of the body it was in the blood, woven like a curse through generations of choices made in candle-lit council chambers. The royal daughters themselves rarely spoke of their suffering. Many could not. Some did not live long enough. But the few who did leave behind strange echoes, diaries with fragmented entries, embroidery with odd, mournful symbols, or music composed in minor chords that no one played twice. In Poland, Princess Jadwiga stitched a tapestry that showed a tree growing inwards, its branches curling back into the roots. It was her only known work. She died at 15. The tapestry now hangs in a museum, labeled Unknown Symbolism. But some scholars know better. They see the warning in her woolen metaphor, and yet, even knowing, nothing changed. The marriage contracts continued. The daughters kept coming. The illnesses deepened. By the 15th century, royal genealogies began to resemble loops more than lines. The same names repeated every few generations: Isabella, Maria, Eleanor, Catherine, each iteration thinner than the last, as if the blood remembered too much. In Castile, a young girl named Beatrice began to scream at night for no reason. Her caretakers assumed she was possessed. An exorcism was performed. It failed. She was chained to her bed for years, her wrists scarred by the iron. A century later, it was discovered she had a rare neurological disorder now known to be hereditary. No one apologized, because to apologize would be to admit fault. To admit fault would unravel kingdoms. In their portraits, the royal daughters look serene. But look closer. The hands often clutch fabric tightly, as if bracing. The eyes, wide but unseeing. The mouths, too small or oddly curved, painted by artists who were paid to flatter. The deformities were softened, but never gone. The viewer could sense something was off, even if they couldn't name it. And sometimes, that's what haunted most. In the north, Scandinavian kings prided themselves on their strong-blooded daughters. But even there, the price was paid. Princess Ingrid of Denmark was born mute. No one knew why. She could hear music but never sing. She smiled but never spoke. She was betrothed to her cousin at 9 and dead by 16. Her grave bears no epitaph, just a carved flower. Over time, whispers turned to rumors, and rumors to silence. Modern scholars now look back and trace the damage. They map the Habsburg jaw, the epilepsies, the hemophilias, the mental illnesses, the shortened lifespans. But while charts and DNA confirm what was once hidden, they cannot capture the loneliness of these daughters, the fear, the longing, the brief moments of laughter in walled gardens, the half-learned lullabies, the dreams of freedom that never left the nursery. In the end, these girls were not villains or victims. They were symbols of a time when purity was prized over health, when bloodlines mattered more than well-being. They were born not to live, but to preserve. And in preserving, they were broken. Their legacy is not in the monuments or titles they never held, but in the warning they offer, that when pride blinds wisdom, it is always the innocent who suffer. And though the world moved on, and monarchies fell, and science advanced, their stories linger in portraits, in bones, in forgotten tower sand, in the lessons no longer whispered, but spoken aloud at last. Inside the cold and echoing halls of medieval castles, beneath the carefully woven tapestries and gilded icons, lived the royal daughters who bore the silent legacy of inbreeding. Their lives were scripted from birth, not by their own desires, but by dynastic strategy. They were not daughters in the sense of family love, but pawns, vessels, instruments of lineage preservation. It began subtly, the way history often does with traditions and customs wrapped in sanctity. Marrying within the bloodline was seen as noble, a measure of purity, a union between cousins, uncles, and nieces, even siblings in some clandestine agreements, was celebrated, not condemned. The church offered its blessings, the court applauded the alliances, and physicians, few of whom understood the risks, turned a blind eye. But the bodies of these girls knew the truth long before the scribes recorded it. The first signs were often overlooked: a drooping eyelid, a pale complexion, a frail limb. These were the whispers of mutation, the soft heralds of what would become the roaring agony of malformed organs, degenerative disorders, and minds clouded by genetic fog. In some courts, the daughters would be confined not for disobedience, but for deformity. They were hidden behind curtains, their appearances managed, their voices silenced. Publicly, they were praised as saints or cloistered as nuns, but in private, they trembled beneath the weight of inherited failure. Their mothers, often also their aunts, kissed their foreheads with guilt masked as duty. Their fathers, who might also be cousins, offered gifts instead of apologies. Generations compounded these mistakes. With each incestuous marriage, the blood thickened with dormant curses. Some daughters could not walk, others could not speak. A few, tragically, could not live beyond infancy. The castles built to protect them became mausoleums of genetic despair. In Spain, the Habsburg jaw became a grotesque symbol, a physical landmark of royal pride turned monstrous. In Portugal, the mental instability of princesses was excused as divine visions, when in truth it was the unraveling of inherited neurological decay. In Austria, the daughters were wed to brothers, whose own hands trembled with the same ancestral affliction. Still, the practice continued, cloaked in prestige and divine right. Those who questioned it were branded as heretics or fools. The daughters themselves, many uneducated in the truths of medicine, believed it was God's will, a test of their piety. Their suffering was sanctified, their pain baptized in court rituals. They bore stillborns with silent tears. They collapsed during childbirth with prayers on their lips. They were paraded during festivals with corsets hiding misshapen spines, with powders disguising blotched skin, with veils masking crossed eyes. Behind each smile was a fracture. Behind each title, a wound. One princess in Burgundy was described as delicate, porcelain-like. In truth, she could not digest solid food past childhood. Another, in a Polish court, was kept in a gilded chamber, not for luxury, but because her shrieks disturbed the court, born from seizures no priest could exorcise. In France, a daughter was proclaimed a miracle for surviving her first winter. She never spoke a word her entire life, and yet, portraits were painted with her eyes forced open by ribbons. Marriages were still arranged for them, contracts signed, dowries exchanged. Their husbands, often cousins, knew of their conditions, but accepted them for land and title. Their wedding nights were rituals of duty, not intimacy. The daughters bled not just from the body, but from generations of manipulation. Some became mothers. Their own children bore the same marks: twisted limbs, hollowed eyes, vacant stares. A cycle repeated, a dynasty poisoned. The silence was deafening. Physicians began to suspect the pattern. A few brave scholars whispered theories of tainted blood, of degeneration. They were ridiculed. Daughters continued to be born and continued to die before their voices could form. Not all daughters suffered visibly. Some lived long lives with trembling hands, brittle bones, and haunted dreams. They became queens, regents, abbesses, but always with the shadow of inbreeding behind them. Their portraits were altered to hide asymmetry. Their letters edited to remove incoherence. Their lives, though decorated in gold, were quietly tragic. By the late medieval period, even the most devout began to question. Whispers grew louder. Marriages between first cousins were delayed, then discouraged, then quietly abandoned in some courts. But the damage had been done. The royal daughters who survived carried it not only in their bodies, but in their souls. In some diaries, never meant to be read, they wrote of dreams where they walked without pain, sang without stuttering, held children who did not die in their arms. These were dreams not of power or wealth, but of normalcy. That was the cost. For all their titles and tapestries, they never tasted simplicity. They were born into cages of velvet, bars sewn by ambition and blind tradition. They were celebrated in public, but mourned in private. The royal daughters of the inbred medieval lines were not failures of nature. They were victims of history. The story of each one was not merely about bloodlines, but about the human toll of unchecked power. Their names are barely remembered, their faces painted over, but their legacy remains, not in the grandeur of their castles, but in the quiet lesson they leave behind. That purity, when pursued without reason, births ruin, and that behind every royal lineage, beneath every crown, may lie the tears of a daughter who never asked for any of it. In the dim recesses of medieval Europe's royal courts, the story of inbreeding was not just etched into the bloodlines, but deeply inscribed into the faces, bodies, and destinies of royal daughters. As centuries dragged on and noble houses tightened their circles of marriage, the consequences grew not only more pronounced but also more tragic. With each successive generation, the noble ideal of keeping blood pure morphed into a silent, cursy hereditary debt, paid most often by daughters born to dynasties that mistook genetics for loyalty. In the cold stone chambers of a forgotten Castilian castle, one such royal daughter, Princess Isabel, was born to parents who were uncle and niece. Her birth was not met with rejoicing, but hushed concern. Her jaw was misaligned, her limbs twisted unnaturally, and her speech delayed for years. Chronic ailments kept her in B.D. for months on end. Her tutors recorded that she wept at the light and shrieked in confusion when music played, unable to process the sounds. Though she had the title of Infanta, her condition barred her from court life, and she passed her days confined in a chamber with barred windows, hidden from the noble guests who might see the cost of pedigree too clearly. Her life was never hers. It was the legacy of a dozen prior unions between cousins, uncles, aunts, and even closer blood. In the Bavarian duchies, one could follow a grotesque lineage of girls born to successive brother-sister matches in the 13th and 14th centuries. These unions were praised for their political stability, their capacity to preserve power, but the daughters born of them bore swollen tongues, missing digits, and minds that struggled to comprehend language. Some never spoke a word. Some lived only to adolescence. Chroniclers did not often write of these girls by name. They were documented instead in ledgers of birth defects and royal affliction, like specimens rather than daughters. Yet in rare confessions, private letters written by despairing queens reveal sorrow cloaked in shame. "My daughter is like a bird that cannot sing," wrote one Duchess of Swabia in 1294. "She watches us, but does not know us. I fear our blood has turned against us." Beyond the physical toll, the social consequences were isolating and cruel. In French courts, daughters with visible defects were often cloistered away in monasteries, not for devotion, but as a means to exile them from the gaze of the aristocracy. These girls were given names like Marguerite or Anne, then never seen again. Some monasteries kept full wings for noble-born girls discarded by families, whose honor could not withstand the deformities their own choices had created. There was a nun in Brittany who kept a secret journal for 40 years, writing of girls who came to the convent limping, stammering, sometimes blind or half-mad, yet always dressed in finery from the chateau they'd left behind. In her pages she wrote, "These are not saints. They are the forgotten daughters sacrificed to the altar of pride." The Habsburgs, later infamous for their pronounced jaw and hunched postures, were not the inventors of this pattern but perhaps its most visible heirs. As early as the 11th century, their female line began to show signs of genetic strain. One princess was noted for her inability to walk upright, another for her soft skull that never hardened. Physicians of the era, still practicing under humoral theory, prescribed leeches and mercury, unaware that the roots of these maladies lay in the shared blood of the child's parents. They wrote of tainted wombs and sorrow-born births, blaming the mothers, without ever questioning the matches that produced such fragile children. But even among all this tragedy, it was often the mind that suffered most invisibly. A princess in Naples was said to have visions from childhood. She claimed angels whispered warnings about her ancestors. She feared mirrors, believing they showed not her reflection, but the faces of her malformed cousins. Eventually, she was declared mad and locked away in a villa guarded by eunuchs. Her writings, discovered centuries later, contain chilling predictions about the fall of her house, all scrawled in a looping, uncertain hand. The royal daughters were not only casualties, they were omens. Their illnesses became the physical prophecy of dynastic collapse. As Spain's royal lineage spiraled into ever tighter coils of consanguinity, each princess born was thinner, paler, quieter. By the 15th century, a chronicler noted that the girls of Aragon spoke in whispers and walked like paper birds. They suffered from seizures, miscarriages, hollow bones. Some bled constantly, others not at all. Each new betrothal came with the unspoken gamble: would this daughter be whole, or would she carry the cracks of generations within her? Their suffering was ritualized. Dowries were paid not only in gold but in silence. When a disfigured daughter was married off, her portrait was doctored, her symptoms downplayed. One Florentine painter was known for painting noblewomen as they should have been, not as they were, smoothing out twisted jaws and replacing sunken eyes with lively ones. His works hang in galleries now, beautiful lies that tell no truth of their subjects. But in locked vaults, the real portraits remain. A girl whose skin bore the blue veins of congenital defect. A child princess with a misshapen cranium painted only once before she died at 5. One such painting bears the note, "Do not display." The weight of legacy crushed these daughters. In a German principality, a girl born with no legs was proclaimed a miracle child by a desperate priest. He preached that her form was divine punishment and divine reward, a warning and a blessing. She was paraded through towns until her bones cracked from the strain. She died at 7. Her body was placed in a gold tomb, but her name was never recorded. The final insult. The history of royal daughters in medieval Europe is not merely one of opulence or tragedy, but of systematic, generational harm. Harm masked as tradition. Harm justified by politics. Harm passed from crown to cradle until the cradle could no longer bear it. The story of inbreeding is not a tale of monsters, but of children born into impossible roles, shaped by choices not their own, doomed by designs made in halls of power. The silence of their lives, their confinement, their exile, their whispered names was not chosen. It was imposed. And in that silence lies the loudest indictment of all. Their faces, if we could see them truly, would ask, was bloodline worth the cost? In the dim recesses of medieval Europe's royal courts, the story of inbreeding was not just etched into the bloodlines but deeply inscribed into the faces, bodies, and destinies of royal daughters. As centuries dragged on and noble houses tightened their circles of marriage, the consequences grew not only more pronounced, but also more tragic. With each successive generation, the noble ideal of keeping blood pure morphed into a silent, cursy, hereditary debt, paid most often by daughters born to dynasties that worship their lineages more than their children. One such daughter was Alianor of Aquitania, born into a lineage so intertwined that her birth was met not with joy, but with a hush of concern. Her limbs were delicate to the point of fragility, her jaw too narrow for proper speech, and by age 5, she suffered constant fevers and seizures that physicians could not explain. As she grew, her world was confined within stone walls and whispers, with tutors speaking in low tones about her unfortunate constitution, and nobles diverting their eyes during court appearances. Her beauty, once hoped to secure an alliance, faded beneath the weight of illness and genetic misfortune. But she was only one of many. In the house of Trastamara in Castile, infamously riddled with intermarriage, the daughters bore a legacy written in stunted stature, cleft palates, twisted spines, and feeble minds. A young princess, Juana, was said to have spent her entire life in a tower chamber, afraid of mirrors and unable to recall her own name some days. The priests believed her afflicted by spirits. The physicians knew better, but could do nothing. Meanwhile, in France, the Valois dynasty quietly buried daughters before their 6th birthdays, their causes of death never listed publicly, but whispered to be the result of internal deformities. One girl, Marie Valerie, was born with a tongue so large it filled her entire mouth, and she drowned in her sleep before she could ever speak a word. Midwives learned to recognize the telltale signs at birth: limbs too short or asymmetrical, heads unusually elongated, eyes misaligned. They carried a shadow with them as they handed the infants to their mothers. Behind velvet curtains, queens wept over daughters who would never walk, never wed, never rule. These were not anomalies. These were patterns. In the Habsburg dynasty, a grotesque parade of deformities culminated in daughters who either perished early or lived lives utterly sequestered from the public eye. Their famous Habsburg jaw caused not just cosmetic disfigurement, but severe breathing and eating difficulties. Portraits were edited. Records were doctored. A girl named Katharina was said to have been born without ears and lived her life in a candle-lit cell beneath a monastery where only one nun, sworn to silence, was allowed to tend her. In Portugal, the House of Aviz carried on the same legacy, with daughters succumbing to epilepsy, madness, and recurring stillbirths when they themselves became mothers. One queen, Isabel, kept a journal that recorded each scream of her daughter's seizures, noting the moon's phase each time in desperation for a pattern. There was none. In England, the Plantagenet line saw its share of tragedy too. Daughters whose hands were clawed from birth, who could not sit upright, who babbled incomprehensibly until their early graves. Physicians blamed it on humors and the will of God. But behind closed doors, midwives passed down private ledgers of family pairings they knew to avoid. These ledgers were ignored by kings whose pride overshadowed caution. In the frigid halls of Scandinavian courts, inbred daughters wandered the corridors in sleep, their minds trapped in repetitive motions and phantom memories. One such girl, Ingrid, believed every mirror to be a window and tried for years to climb through them to the other side, where she believed her real family lived. By 15, she had pulled the glass from her arms so many times her fingers no longer bent. In Burgundy, a child named Renee was born with legs that bent backwards at the knee. She was kept in a wheeled cradle and only brought out during feasts, where she sat motionless beside her mother, as nobles pretend, dead, not to stare. The servants spoke of her as the angel who could not walk, and poets wrote verses of her as a symbol of divine patience. But she suffered. Her pain was constant, and her loneliness deeper than the stone walls that surrounded her. Daughters became symbols of political failures, of divine punishment, of ancestral sins. And while sons were granted armor and forgiveness, daughters bore the brunt of their family's genetic weight in silence. They were hidden, or married off hastily, or made to join convents where vows of silence ensured their conditions remained unspoken. Some were given to distant cousins in remote castles with instructions to keep her comfortable. There, they faded into footnotes, but those who lived left behind trails and letters never sent. In embroidery bearing broken patterns, in lullabies they whispered to themselves. In the House of Savoy, a daughter named Marguerite became known for sewing tapestries that featured animals with too many eyes and limbs. Her last work, discovered decades after her death, showed a woman with two faces smiling, one screaming. Historians marvel at the precision of the stitching. They ignore what it tried to say. The consequences of inbreeding were not simply physical. They were spiritual. They broke spirits before they broke bodies. Daughters learned to be ashamed of their reflection, to associate pain with identity, to believe they were born wrong for a reason. Priests told them it was God's lesson in humility. They accepted this because no one offered another answer. And through it all, the wheels of royal succession turned, slow and grinding, over the bones of forgotten daughters who never stood a chance. In time, their names faded, but their patterns did not. Each malformed hand, each locked jaw, each lifeless cry in the night echoed the choices of kings and queens who prized bloodlines over breath. In the candlelit corners of Europe's greatest palaces, the portraits of healthy daughters still hang, but behind them lie the shadows of those who never got a frame, who never got a name on a scroll, whose lives were written not in ink, but in silence. In the shadowy depths of medieval strongholds, the chilling silence of thick stone corridors bore witness to secrets that would never reach the ears of common folk. Life within castles seemed majestic from afar. But for the royal daughters, born under the looming specter of inbreeding, their world was anything but regal. The harsh truth of lineage preservation through bloodline purity wove a tapestry of sorrow, deformity, and silent suffering that stretched across generations, tightening its grip with every cousin-bound union. These daughters, swaddled in silk and crowned with obligation, carried not just the burden of dynasty, but the invisible weight of genetic consequence. As chroniclers inked tales of kings and battles, their quills hesitated at the stories of women whose lives unraveled behind tapestry-laden walls. Whispers of hunchbacked princesses, speechless duchesses, and daughters who never reached womanhood were dismissed as divine punishment or ill fate. But the truth lay in the blood that bound too closely. Physicians of the age, shackled by limited understanding and bound by loyalty to the crown, could offer little more than leeches and prayers. Pale-faced girls who trembled at the sound of church bells, unable to tolerate the clamor of the world outside, were hidden away in convents or tower rooms. One such girl, Lady Elsinore of Bretagne, was born to siblings whose union was sanctioned to preserve the duchy's claim. Elsinore never spoke a word after the age of 3, and by 12, her joints had twisted into unnatural angles, making every movement an agony. Her nursemaid whispered that Elsinore would hum to herself at night, a haunting tune that sounded like mourning in miniature. Another tale followed Princess Ilaria of Asturias, born with translucent skin and sunken eyes that seemed too old for her infant face. Ilaria's bones shattered with alarming ease. A tumble from her cradle was enough to break her arm. Her parents, ashamed and fearful, claimed a divine curse had been placed upon her, and she was sent to a mountaintop convent where she withered in obscurity. Meanwhile, across the courts of Burgundy, records noted a child named Odeline, who never developed the ability to walk or eat without assistance. Her limbs hung loosely, marionette-like, and her jaw remained clenched so tightly she had to be fed with special tools. Her father, Duke Alaric, had married his own niece to prevent foreign claims to his estate. Though he paraded himself as a man of foresight and authority, he wept in secret when Odeline's attendants described her night terrors and constant seizures. Unlike the sculpted icons of queens and saints that adorned cathedral walls, the reality of royal daughters bore none of the divine perfection that artists portrayed. They were born into gilded cages, their double wings clipped not by enemies or fate, but by the hubris of their forebears. In the court of Naples, a physician named Matteo dared to document the affliction of noble wombs. His scrolls described symptoms now identifiable as hereditary disorders, hemophilia, hydrocephalus, and cognitive regression among them. But the church deemed his writings heretical. Matteo was stripped of his titles, his work burned in the town square, and he vanished soon after. Still, his fragments survived in secret libraries, revealing patterns that could no longer be denied. Nobles saw inbreeding not as sin, but as strategy. Marrying cousins, uncles, and even siblings ensured power remained within the family, that rival houses could not lay claim to lands and titles. But such strategy came at a devastating cost, and that cost was most visible in the daughters. Boys who exhibited signs of weakness were often passed off as stillborn, quietly replaced or hidden. But girls, especially firstborns, were expected to be shown, married, used as pawns. A malformed daughter could not fetch a powerful match. She became a liability. Some were wed to much older, equally damaged men to keep the flock contained. Others were hidden entirely, their existence scrubbed from family trees. Monasteries grew full of young women with noble blood and shattered minds. To the outside world, these institutions were havens of piety. In reality, many were holding grounds, a place to store what could not be displayed. Tales emerged of nuns who never spoke, who walked only at night, their faces always hidden. Superstition cloaked their silence in mystery. But behind the veils were the results of generations of genetic collapse. Sometimes, these daughters were raised to believe their suffering was holy, that their pain was payment for the sins of mankind. Confessors encouraged them to embrace their deformities as blessings. In one haunting example, a princess named Mariette was said to bear stigmata wounds that bled in tandem with Christ's passion. But Matteo's scrolls revealed the truth. Her skin was so fragile it tore with the slightest pressure. Her miraculous bleeding was not divine, but genetic. The masses, craving wonders, refused the medical explanation. Mariette died during Lent, and her tomb was venerated until the bones beneath were exhumed centuries later, showing signs of brittle bone disease. Throughout Europe, similar patterns emerged. The Habsburg jaw, infamous for its prominence and dental dysfunction, plagued royal houses for centuries. Daughters born with jaws too large to close, tongues too big for their mouths, and speech so slurred it became indistinct. Portraits painted their best angles, but those who met them in person described grotesque suffering. Meals were impossible without help. Some could not swallow without choking. A Spanish princess, believed to be Maria Antonia, was described by a visitor as a flower with waxen petals, lovely from afar, but crumbling at touch. Her beauty was feigned, but her internal suffering, chronic and worsening, was never acknowledged in court. She died before the age of 18, from complications her physicians could not explain. In truth, they had no tools to combat what centuries of consanguineous marriage had created. As centuries passed, the whispers grew louder. In the Enlightenment, as science clawed its way into royal medicine, some brave scholars began to connect the dots. Inbreeding, once seen as noble preservation, was now whispered as curse. But by then, generations of damage had been done. The royal daughters of medieval Europe, those whose lives ended in early graves or within cloistered silence, were the silent evidence of empire's blind ambition. And though their names have faded, their stories remain in bone, in buried scrolls, and in the haunted lullabies passed down by caretakers who remembered the girls not as cursed, but as casualties of pride. The winds that swept through castle towers may have carried the sound of hymns and heralds, but also the sighs of daughters, never allowed to bloom. As the stars turned above the ramparts, they looked down upon lives unchosen, upon bloodlines that had twisted into knots, and upon hearts that beat quietly behind heavy doors, waiting for a dawn that never came. Behind thick, velvet drapes, and beyond the lattice windows of high castle chambers, the lives of royal daughters twisted further into isolation, their suffering cloaked in etiquette and duty. In the heart of Central Europe, Countess Aurelia of Hohenberg was said to have eyes that never blinked. At her christening, a monk whispered that her stare was the gaze of a saint, unbroken and unwavering. In reality, her condition was a congenital ocular disorder caused by generations of inbreeding. Her eyes remained wide due to malformed lids, drying out until tears of blood ran down her cheeks in cold months. The court considered it a holy sign. Her mother, a duchess, who had wed her first co-sin, wept silently behind her veil. Nobility regarded these children as puzzles to be managed, sometimes with tenderness, but more often with fear. Physicians developed contraptions meant to straighten limbs, force jaw alignment, or train twisted spines into something more presentable. In the halls of Castile, young Infanta Isabel underwent hours of painful therapies, strapped to wooden boards to elongate her body. Each scream was muffled behind thick stone walls. Her father forbade servants from speaking of her outside the keep. Rumors still spread that she had the feet of a goat, that her hands curled inward like claws, that her voice, when it came, sounded like birds crying. She died at 12. Her bedchamber was sealed, her name never again spoken in court. The birth of each royal daughter brought a mixture of celebration and dread. Midwives were often sworn to secrecy. If the infant showed signs of deformity, decisions were swift. In some places, the child was baptized and then quietly removed, sent to distant abbeys or noble estates under assumed names. In others, the child was kept but hidden, shown only to foreign envoys via carefully staged appearances. The tapestry of deception was woven with gold thread. Even portraits, those eternal witnesses, were altered. Artists softened jawlines, narrowed eyes, painted hands that were in reality malformed. In the Polish court, a princess named Jadwiga was known for her beauty, alabaster skin, rosebud lips, and cascading golden hair. But hidden beneath her brocade gowns were legs twisted so severely she could not walk. Her paintings showed her standing proudly, a fiction that fooled even suitors. She was wed by proxy to a distant duke, who upon meeting her wept in rage and demanded annulment. She lived out her days in a tower, her only companion a mute servant girl who had once been a stable hand. These daughters were often victims of emotional neglect. Their value, weighed in alliances and dowries, plummeted if they bore visible signs of weakness. In some courts, they were married off to aging warlords or foreign nobles with unsavory reputations, as a way to dispose of embarrassment. One such case was Lady Celestine of Aquitaine, sent at age 15 to wed a Norse chieftain twice her age. She had a congenital tremor, her hands in constant motion. The wedding was brief. She died of exposure en route to the fjords. Her body later returned in a sealed box. Her family declared it an accident, though some whispered she had been cast overboard to avoid shame. Meanwhile, monastic orders brimmed with noble-born women whose names had been erased from scrolls. The Abbey of St. Neri held a wing, known only to senior sisters, a place where the disfigured and voiceless daughters of kings whispered to one another by candlelight. One nun there, Sister Claudette, had a second face-like growth on her shoulder. Some believed she had absorbed a twin in the womb. Her prayers were constant, her eyes two different colors. She was said to dream in Latin, waking with hymns on her lips. Few visitors saw the inner cloister. Those who did never spoke of it. Occasionally, one of these women would escape her confines through writing. Hidden diaries, marginalia and psalters, even coded embroidery served as outlets. In one such diary, Penned by a girl, known only as A, there is a passage. I was born of blue blood, but cursed from first breath. My fingers do not stretch, and my back bends like an old woman's. Mother says I am God's trial. I dream of open fields, but I live in stone. The raw ache in her words transcends centuries. Each royal household kept its own customs of concealment. In Bavaria, royal daughters born with speech impediments were trained not to speak at all. Their gestures taught to be graceful, their expressions serene. A girl named Helene became known as the Silent Swan. She appeared in court ceremonies like a vision, pale, slender, draped in silver, but never uttered a word. Those close to her knew it was not piety, but physical inability. Her tongue was malformed, her palate high and narrow. Food was always a struggle, but her silence was mistaken for wisdom, and she was revered. No one knew the pain behind her glassy stare, the weight of centuries pressed upon these daughters. They were artifacts of dynastic ambition, relics of genetic gamble, and prisoners of their own blood. The church, for all its sanctuary, often contributed to their suffering. Priests spoke of divine tests, of redemptive suffering. Girls with twisted bodies were called martyrs. Those with visions, often hallucinations from untreated fevers or neurological damage, were hailed as prophets. In truth, they were children in pain, forced into roles that erased their humanity. Not all stories ended in darkness. A few, by twist of fate or maternal defiance, found compassion. In Normandy, Lady Yasmina's mother defied tradition, refusing to send her deformed child away. She educated her in sec, ret, brought scholars to the estate, taught her philosophy and natural sciences. Yasmina, who could not walk and had only partial use of her arms, became a brilliant mind. Her letters to monasteries survive, filled with insight and empathy. She never married, never bore children, but her words influenced abbots and scholars across Europe. She died peacefully at 40, surrounded by candles and books. Yet Yasmina was an exception. For every story like hers, there were hundreds of girls lost to silence. Their names do not echo in history. Their portraits hang in dusty halls, beautiful lies on canvas, and beneath the stones of ancient convents. In forgotten crypts, their bones remain, twisted, brittle, and mute, the lasting legacy of inbreeding, not seen as sin, but as strategy. When we imagine the medieval world, we think of knights and kings, banners and battles. But in the quiet rooms where daughters wept alone, the true cost of empire unfolded. As the moonlight spilled across cold chamber floors, it touched faces that had never known freedom. Not from walls, nor blood, nor expectation. Their lullabies were silent, their stories nearly erased. But in the wind that still whispers through ruined cloisters, their sorrow lives on. In a quiet corner of medieval Europe, amid snow-covered hills and shadowy fir groves, stood Castle Edelbruck, its stone towers blackened by wind and time. Within its cold chambers lived Princess Adelinde, the last surviving daughter of the Vildemore line. Generations of consanguineous unions had reduced the family tree into a tightly knotted braid, and Adelinde bore the cost of that entanglement. She was born with fused vertebrae, rendering her back as stiff as marble. Her skull bore an unusual shape, elongated and sloped, which made it difficult for her to hold her head upright without pain. And yet, at her christening, her father proclaimed her perfect, an heir to divine symmetry, unaware that his praise was born from delusion rather than truth. The court physicians, hardened men in soot-streaked robes, devised a metal brace that encased her spine, affixed with leather straps and iron rivets. The sound of her approach was heralded by the soft creak of steel and leather, a tragic overture for a girl who never played. She could not run, nor dance, nor lie down without assistance. Servants were instructed to never meet her gaze. Her face, though pallid and angular, was beautiful in a spectral way, her large eyes too wide, her lips too narrow. her nose delicate and almost translucent. Her voice, when she spoke, came in a strange cadence, halting and echoing faintly, as if filtered through water. The lords and ladies of Edelbrook whispered that she was a child of snow spirits, a creature of the old woods. In truth, she was simply a girl broken by the ambition of her ancestors. In the summer of her 12th year, Adelinde began to experience violent seizures, her body convulsing in the dead of night, limbs thrashing, teeth biting into her tongue. The castle's cleric declared it demonic possession. For weeks, she was kept tied to her bed, her wrists raw from bindings. Incense burned day and night until the walls reeked of myrrh and mildew. At last, a traveling herbalist was summoned, who recognized the fits as signs of epilepsy, another echo of inherited fragility. He brewed teas of valerian and poppy, which dulled her mind but eased her pain. And still, she was paraded before visiting nobles, painted in silks, her brace hidden beneath padded gowns. She curtsied in perfect stillness, her face trained to smile. Once the guests departed, she was returned to her shadowed room, where she lay watching spiderwebs tremble in the torchlight. The fate of royal daughters was always transactional. In Provence, the Lady Melisende was wed at 13 to a cousin twice removed. Their union was intended to preserve ancestral lands. Both were products of long inbreeding Melisende, with a stutter and fragile bones, her groom with jaundiced eyes, and a penchant for cruelty. Within a year, she bore a stillborn child, and a year after, another. Her pelvis, narrow and misshapen, made childbirth a gauntlet of agony. Her final labor ruptured her womb. She died in a bloody fever, and the midwife was burned at the stake for failure. The marriage contract outlived them both. In the Carpathians, a princess named Alona lived in a monastery converted into a winter palace. Her family, ashamed of her cleft palate and curved spine, had withdrawn her from public view before her 6th birthday. The rooms she inhabited were painted with frescoes of saints and martyrs, but her mind was sharper than her caretakers realized. She learned to read by candlelight, tracing fingers along dusty scrolls. She wrote letters to unseen siblings, constructing a world from imagination and stolen glimpses of sunrise. When she was 14, a visiting bishop discovered her poems carved into the walls with hairpins. He ordered them scrubbed, fearing her words spoke of heresy. Ilona was then transferred to a convent across the mountains, where she lived to an old age, her mind intact, though her body withered. Her writings survive only in fragments, but even these whisper of a luminous soul, smothered by blood and duty. The castle of Sauterne kept its royal daughters underground literally. A system of subterranean rooms was built beneath the west wing, accessible only by servants sworn to silence. There lived twins, Helene and Magritte, both born with cranial deformities and fused digits. They were called the Stones by the maids, for their skin was pale and cool, and their limbs moved slowly. They were never baptized, never shown to the public. They played with shadows and flickering torches, whispering to each other in a language of their own. When plague swept through the region, the castle emptied. The twins were left locked below. Weeks later, when food ran out, they were found huddled together, lifeless, surrounded by scratched walls and broken dolls. A monk buried them in unmarked graves, and the entrance to the underground wing was sealed with brick and mortar. Their parents erected a chapel above it, never mentioning them again. The tragedy of these girls was not merely in their bodies, but in the denial of their personhood. Royal courts measured daughters in dowries, in alliances, in aesthetic perfection. Anything less was hidden, corrected, or discarded. Yet within the boundaries of these failed designs lived souls that yearned for sunlight, for affection, for the right to be seen as more than consequence. In a Venetian diary from the 14th century, a noblewoman records a moment with her younger sister, a hunchback child named Chiara. She asked if angels too must marry for land. The entry reads, I wept, for I could not answer. That single line has echoed through history louder than any royal decree. By the late medieval period, whispers of genetic damage began to reach scholarly ears. Arabic physicians, translated into Latin, spoke of bloodlines, of anomalies, passed down not by curses, but by proximity. A few noble houses, wary of the rumors, began to introduce new blood from merchant classes or distant provinces. But the practice of dynastic inbreeding, entrenched by politics and pride, endured for centuries longer. The royal daughters, born into this lattice of repetition, bore not only their family's name, but its scars. They smiled through pain, sang through deformity, and knelt before altars that offered no solace. In the cathedrals where their likenesses stood in stained glass, flawless, golden, serene, the reality remained buried. Beneath their images lay tombs, filled with twisted bones, letters never sent, lullabies never sung. And though the pages of official history seldom mention their names, their shadows linger in forgotten crypts, in crumbling ledgers, in the echo of footsteps across cold stone floors. Their legacy is not one of royalty, but of resilience. And when night falls over ancient ruins, and the wind rustles ivy-covered walls, perhaps it is their breath. You hear a reminder that behind every crown lay a daughter who longed simply to be whole. In the heart of the kingdom of Aquitania, surrounded by emerald fields and amber vineyards, stood Chateau Valremy, a fortress wrapped in legends of old blood and tragic beauty. Within its high towers, Princess Isabeau was born beneath a blood moon, her first cry muted, her skin tinged with a violet hue. The midwives exchanged uneasy glances. Her fingers were webbed. Her left eye sat slightly higher than the right, and her breathing was shallow, gurgling, as if her lungs were made of reeds. Yet she was declared a divine sign, moon-blessed, the court whispered. In truth, she was a mirror of centuries of closed doors and cousin-bonded crowns. Her parents, both descended from the same ancestral line that traced back to Charlemagne, bore matching features and matching flaws. A family known for their raven hair, sharp chins, and short tempers, and for their increasing susceptibility to deformity and madness. Isabeau, as she grew, did not speak until the age of 5, and even then, her words were often jumbled, spoken as if through a thick veil. She limped when she walked, her hips disjointed. Her tutors despaired, for she could not read beyond simple prayers. But she loved color. Every window in her room was adorned with glass in shades of cobalt and crimson. She would sit in her wooden chair, sunlight pouring over her face, humming to herself, threading ribbons through her hair. The courtiers, uncomfortable with her presence, referred to her as the silent saint. Yet none dared challenge her place in the lineage. After all, she was the only heir. When she turned 12, a portrait was commissioned. The painter, a Flemish master, was instructed to render her with dignity. What emerged was a haunting image, Isabeau's gaze distant, her mouth slightly ajar, hands folded like a marionette's, her gown embroidered with thistles and moons. The painting was hung in the hall of lineage, beneath a fresco of ancestral knights, as if to remind all who entered of the cost of unbroken blood. Far across the continent, in the snowbound reaches of Bohemia, lived the royal sisters Anneliese and Katerina, born 6 months apart from separate mothers, but from the same father, a duke who believed the purity of blood must be preserved by any means. The girls were raised as twins. Anneliese, the elder, had brittle bones that snapped at even minor falls. Her legs were permanently braced with ivory splints. Katerina, more physically able, suffered from violent mood swings and episodes where she believed herself to be a wolf. At times, she would bite her own arms until they bled. The court physicians diagnosed her with melancholia and possession alternately. They were kept together in a solar room atop the western turret, isolated from others, tended by a mute, wet nurse. There, They created a language of tapping and blinking, their own form of communication that none could interpret. When the Duke died, they were forgotten. Years later, when invaders stormed the castle, the sisters were found still alive, skeletal and draped in furs, sitting in silence, fingers entwined. In Milan, the Duchess Rosamunda was known as the Chalk Lady. Pale as fresh parchment, her joints refused to bend naturally. She could not walk without pain and was often carried in a sedan chair by 4 eunuchs. Her family had married cousins upon cousins, and she was their prize, a fragile jewel locked in a case of bone. She was married at 15 to a merchant's son, an effort by her father to refresh the line. The boy was kind but ignorant. He saw Rosamunda's condition as a curse and avoided her chambers. She died without ever knowing touch. Her journals, discovered decades later, revealed a girl of exquisite insight. "I am a castle of bones," she wrote once, "but inside, I am fire." Each line a scream against her imposed silence. Meanwhile, in Aragon, Princess Serafina was born with a thick mane of hair and a chest cavity that pulsed visibly beneath translucent skin. The monks declared her touched by God, but as she grew, it became clear her heart beat erratically, and she suffered from constant fatigue and bouts of fainting. She was confined to a bed woven of goose feathers and silk, and her meals were delivered on trays of silver. Though she ate little, her family boasted of her beauty to foreign courts, circulating miniature paintings that concealed her frailty. When a suitor finally arrived, he was not permitted to see her until after the engagement. Upon entering her chamber, he fled in horror, later claiming she had the face of a seraph and the breath of the tomb. The marriage was annulled. Serafina died at 17. Her final words, whispered to her maid, "Do not let them paint me again." In Brittany, an abbey kept records of the forgotten girls, daughters of nobility, hidden away in cloisters, not for spiritual calling, but for their appearance. Some were hunchbacked, others club-footed. One, Sister Beatrice, was noted as having the face of a nightjar. They were given Latin names, cloaked in veils, and their origins erased. Yet their letters to Rome, some of which survive, paint portraits of souls brimming with wit, frustration, and longing. Beatrice wrote once, "My prayers are heard, but not answered. I ask not for miracles, only for mirrors." The repetition of blood, intended to preserve thrones, instead preserved tragedy. Generation after generation, the daughters of power bore the physical cost of decisions made in echo chambers of politics. They were mothers who could not bear, wives who were never wed, children raised without laughter. And through it all, they remained unseen, their lives footnotes in dynastic ledgers. Yet history has begun to reclaim them through letters smuggled in sleeves, through portraits that defy the expected, through architecture that whispers of rooms long sealed. Their stories are not of weakness, but of survival within a system that prized legacy over life. When you stand in the ruins of medieval castles and see the high windows with bars, think not only of enemies kept out, but daughters kept in. And when you read the Chronicles of Kings, remember the sisters who watched from shadows, aching for a world beyond their blood. Beneath the Gothic arches of Krakow's royal chapel, illuminated only by flickering candles and the gold leaf halos of saints staring from mosaics, a birth took place shrouded in omens. The queen, already in her 40th year and wed to her own nephew, screamed through the night, her cries echoing like wounded wolves in the cloister. When the baby girl emerged, the silence was deafening. She was tiny, bird-boned, and blue around the mouth. She did not cry. The wet nurse slapped her feet, her cheeks, her chest. The infant's mouth finally opened, but only a whimper came out. The royal physicians declared her alive, but of ghostly constitution. She was named Jadwiga, after the great Queen Saint of Poland, and carried immediately to the relic chamber for blessing. Her father, the king, refused to look upon her face. For her first year, Jadwiga's cradle was kept in the reliquary beside the armbone of Saint Casimir. The servants swore she giggled when no one was around. By age 5, her legs remained thin as reeds, and her head too large for her frame. She was fed on soft-boiled grains and warm mead, and though she could understand commands, her mouth formed no words. A nun was assigned to teach her music, and Jadwiga took to the zither like it was part of her soul. Her fingers, though frail, moved with uncanny grace, and the music she produced had an eerie, echoing quality. It became the only way she could communicate joy. One night, during a court feast, the king insisted she be brought before the nobles to perform. Dressed in silver thread, her head wreathed in ivy, she strummed the zither while tears slid down her cheeks. Not one word passed her lips, but the melody made the room still, so silent one could hear every crackling torch and shifting goblet. When she finished, the room erupted in hollow applause. She bowed awkwardly, was led back to her quarters, and was never summoned again. She died in her 12th winter, her body unable to survive a lung infection. Her zither was buried with her beneath the chapel, but the nuns claimed they still heard its strings at night, vibrating with invisible hands. In a fortress on the edge of the Alps, Princess Ermesinde of Savoy was raised in a tower that overlooked an abyss. Her family, deeply intermarried with the Burgundians and the Valois, had suffered generations of congenital ailments. Ermesinde's face bore the signs: a narrow jaw, drooping eyelids, and an extra finger on each hand. Her tutors taught her embroidery, not by choice, but because writing caused spasms in her arms. Her mother instructed the seamstresses to create long sleeves that hid her hands at all times. At court appearances, she sat beside her father but never spoke. Whispers floated about her being mute, possessed, or cursed. At 13, she began experiencing seizures, the first during a feast celebrating the new harvest. She collapsed into her bowl of pheasant stew and was dragged away like a sack of flour. Afterward, she was confined entirely to her tower, known as the Queen's High Room. There she remained for 4 years, visited only by an old apothecary and a jester who had once served her grandfather. She began writing with charcoal on the walls, symbols and verses no one could decipher. By 17, she no longer recognized her reflection. The apothecary's notes describe her as lucid only during the waxing moon. When she died, the tower was sealed with stone. A century later, when lightning struck and cracked T open, monks found the walls covered from floor to ceiling with strange constellations and phrases in 3 languages: Latin, Occitan, and a dialect unknown to any scholar. In the coastal courts of Brittany, Lady Adelise was called La Belle Morte, even while she lived. She was a cousin marriage of 2 houses, notorious for epilepsy, anxiety disorders, and facial malformations. Adelice's features were doll-like but frozen. She could not smile. Her eyelids drooped, her upper lip never fully closed. Her voice, when she spoke, had a distant, echoing quality, like someone underwater. Her family dressed her in heavy velvet gowns, corsets too tight, adorned in pearls that hung over her motionless chest. At balls, she was propped on a settee as a visual ornament. A poet once wrote, "She is as if carved from silence." At 15, she was betrothed to a Catalonian prince who was blind. When he finally met her, he was entranced by her stillness, mistaking it for grace. They were wed, and she was sent south. There, away from her kin, her condition worsened. She began to hallucinate, often seeing mothers with no mouths in her mirror. She gave birth once, a boy with webbed hands and a missing rib, who lived 3 days. Her husband, ashamed, sent her to a nunnery, where she spent her remaining years painting faceless portraits. Her final canvas was of herself, but instead of a mouth, she had painted only a keyhole. Further east, in the thick forests of Wallachia, tales speak of the moon daughters, twin girls born to the Draculesti line. after 4 generations of inbreeding. Their names were Serena and Viorica. Both were albino, with red eyes and near-translucent skin. The midwives wanted to kill them at birth, believing them demons, but the matriarch of the house forbade it. "They carry the old blood," she said. As they grew, the girls became reclusive, unable to tolerate sunlight or loud sounds. They lived in the wine cellar, their skin covered in lace even at night. The servants claimed they whispered to the rats, and that the shadows moved differently when the girls were near. Once, a visiting priest tried to exorcise them. He vanished. Only his cross was found, snapped in two. By 16, Serena died of a fever, and Viorica slit her wrists on the same day. They were buried beneath the black elm, without markings. But every spring, the tree weeps sap the color of blood. A scholar who visited years later wrote in his journal, "The soil here remembers pain. In all these stories, we do not find evil but the consequences of unnatural design. Daughters, born not of love, but of calculation. Bloodlines valued more than lives. Doors locked not by key, but by name." And still they dreamed. Of meadows beyond walls, of names beyond titles, of bodies that did not betray them. In their silence was poetry, in their pain prophecy. And though they died young, behind veils and gates, their stories live, woven in stone, in song, in the wind that moves through ruined keeps. Listen, and you may still hear them. In the frostbitten heart of Scandinavia, where pine forests met the fjords and winter seemed to swallow time itself, there lived a royal girl named Astrid, whose existence was bound by lineage and silence. She was the product of 2 interwoven dynasties whose family trees had long ceased to branch. Born with a pale sheen to her eyes and a gait that twisted her left leg inward, Astrid's nurses swaddled her in ermine and prayed daily for her strength. She never spoke a word in her first 6 years, and the king her father and second cousin to her mother referred to her as the Whisper. A crown was crafted for her baptism, a silver circlet inlaid with sapphires, though it hung crooked on her small, misshapen skull. Her hair grew in patches, her fingers bent unnaturally at the knuckles, and her spine bowed like a crescent moon. The court physician wrote she had an internal frost that no fire could thaw. Yet Astrid possessed a gift that terrified. Those who served Hirsch could recall entire books read aloud to her, word for word, with eerie precision. At night, she would lie awake reciting sagas to herself in dead languages, whispering passages no one remembered teaching her. By her 9th year, she was banished from court functions and confined to a tower overlooking the northern sea. She etched runes into the walls with a shard of obsidian, and when ravens gathered at her windowsill, the servants refused to enter. In the final year of her life, she grew stiller, colder, and on the night of the winter solstice, her heart stopped while she sat upright, her lips parted as if mid-spell. Her body was left untouched for 3 days, and when the priest arrived to bless her, her skin was already pale blue, like sea glass. In Iberia, under the warm sun and dust-swept plains, Infanta Isabel of León was known as La Flor de Cera, the wax flower. Born of repeated cousin unions between Castilian and Aragonese royalty, Isabel emerged into the world with a cleft palate, a shrunken torso, and limbs too long for her body. Her wet nurse wept upon seeing her, and her mother turned her face to the wall. Doctors from Córdoba were summoned to reshape the child, employing tapes and wooden braces to mold her body into something more palatable. Her arms were strapped to boards each night, her jaw encased in metal. At 4, she developed tremors. At 6, she began to scream in her sleep. At 8, her nurse found her sleepwalking, standing barefoot in the cactus garden, whispering to the moon. The priests attributed it to melancholy humors, and she was prescribed crushed pearls and rosewater. Her tutors attempted to teach her calligraphy, but her hands shook too violently. Instead, She took to carving patterns into fruit peels, mandarins, pomegranates, melons, producing images so detailed they resembled illuminated manuscripts. She was promised to a duke twice her age, who died of fever before the wedding. His death was seen as divine mercy. Isabel lived until 15, then faded like a dried flower in summer heat. Her last words, overheard by a nun, were, "The orange trees do not remember me." To the north, in the isolated swamplands of Saxony, there existed a forgotten estate where Lady Agnetha, the only daughter of the von Trier line, lived amid rot and silence. Her family's blood had mingled with itself for centuries, birthing a legacy of madness, bone diseases, and prophetic dreams. Agnetha was born with brittle bones that cracked upon touch, her skin bruised at the slightest contact, and she was kept in a bed of goose feathers, surrounded by violet-scented gauze. Her eyes were oversized, her jaw misaligned, and one side of her body was shorter than the other. Her mother died during birth, and her father, upon seeing her, ordered all mirrors removed from the estate. For the first years of her life, Agnetha was believed to be blind, though by 7 she began describing in great detail things she could not possibly have seen: dreams of fire, of crows in cathedrals, of pale girls dancing in blood. Her caregivers, terrified, began to write her visions in journals. The estate priest claimed her dreams matched omens from scripture. At 10, her spine collapsed further, and she could no longer walk. She was wheeled through the halls, trailing lace and sage smoke, her head adorned with silver combs. Her speech was slurred but poetic. She spoke in rhymes and riddles. On the eve of her 14th birthday, she foretold her own death. "The walls will weep, and the lilies will sleep," she said. That night, a storm broke the roof, and she passed in her sleep. Her coffin was carved from the tree struck by lightning, and her body buried upright, so she may keep watching. In the marshes of Flanders, a nobleman's daughter named Marguerite lived a life measured by breath and bruise. She was one of 13 children, 10 of whom died before the age of 5. Her parents were siblings, disguised by marriage and cloaked in papal indulgence. Marguerite's face was asymmetrical, her heart weak, her skin mottled. At 2, she stopped growing. At 5, she spoke with a stutter, so severe that servants believed she was cursed. The family priest attempted an exorcism. Marguerite bit him. Her laughter was rare, but Brightsome said it made even the crows fall quiet. She was educated in herbs and apothecary arts, spending hours grinding seeds and drying petals, learning their uses not from books, but from intuition. She created balms that soothed fevers, teas that quieted nightmares. Villagers came secretly to her for help, calling her the broken healer. Her family hid this, ashamed of her popularity. At 17, her lungs collapsed during a cold spring. On the night of her death, the garden she tended bloomed all at once, even the dead roses. A friar passing by said, "The earth grieves with her." These daughters, scattered across Europe, were not anomalies, but echoes, whispers of a system that valued bloodlines more than breath, purity more than pain. Their lives, though brief and bent, held truth no counsel would ever speak aloud. They were marked not by their defects, but by their endurance, by the way they held sorrow like a song, their hands trembling, their hearts loud in a world that demanded silence. In their stares, histories unravel. In their deaths, dynasties shudder. Close your eyes now. Can you feel them? Beneath the soil, in old stone halls, in the winds that carry lullabies no one remembers writing. They are still here, still singing, still whole. In the winding alleys of Avignon, where sunlight fell like butter across the stone walls and shadows clung to cloisters and cathedral spires, lived a girl named Geneviève, the last daughter of the de Chamfort bloodline. The name was once noble, spoken in courts from Toulouse to Burgundy, but years of arranged marriages between cousins, uncles, and nieces had left the line not gilded but fragile, like glass filigree. Geneviève was born in silence, her cries withheld by a fused jaw and malformed palate. She could not nurse. A goat was brought into the palace to feed her. She slept in a silver cradle, but convulsed nightly, her bones clicking under the strain of her own growth. Her limbs were thin, too long for her torso, and her pupils did not dilate with light. Her hair came in tufts of white. Her fingernails grew in spirals. She was taught to read through pictures, pointing and blinking when something pleased her. At 6, she could identify herbs, but not her own reflection. The court called her La Sainte de Sang Pur, the saint of pure blood, but no one dared kiss her cheek. At Mass, she wore a veil. She began to hum a strange melody at 8, the same 4-note pattern, again and again, even in her sleep. It matched no known hymn. Her father, who had once held her in trembling hands, took to drink and prayer, confessing each week that he had broken the thread of God's design. At 11, she stopped growing entirely. By 13, her heart murmurs became louder than her footsteps. When she died, the nuns bathed her in wine and salt and wrapped her in linen scented with cedar and rue. No one came to her burial. In the Bohemian hills, beyond the reach of merchants and kings, lay a monastery where noble families sent their daughters deemed too strange for society. It was called Svata Ticha Holy Silent Sand. There, in the southmost cell, lived Clara, daughter of 2 royal siblings from Prague. Her arrival was veiled in secrecy. She had been born with no eyelids, and her eyes had to be sewn shut. Her skin was translucent, her blood visibly coursing through her arms like crimson rivers. Clara never learned to speak, but she could sense motion and heat, turning her head toward the flicker of a candle, the warmth of a hand. She grew slowly, her ribs sharp against paper-thin flesh. The abbess taught her to weave, guiding her hands through wool soaked in rosewater. Her tapestries were nightmarish impossible scenes of angels with split mouths, staircases that led into fire, and crowned women dissolving into dust. Visitors from nearby towns swore the tapestries moved when no one watched. One nun claimed Clara's weavings foretold her sister's death. She was forbidden from weaving thereafter, her loom broken and burned. She began instead to paint with her fingers, creating spirals and runes across the stone floor of her cell. At 15, during a solar eclipse, she passed away. The cell grew cold for days, and moss refused to grow on its walls for a generation. To the east, in the vineyards of Transylvania, Countess Ileana was born under a blood moon, the only surviving child of a line so interbred its branches were more knot than tree. Her mother had birthed 5 children before her, each stillborn or soon dead. Ileana arrived small and blue, breathing only after being submerged in icy water. Her features were unnerving eyes too wide, a smile that stretched too far, teeth that grew in double rows. By 4, she could memorize faces with terrifying precision, drawing guests she saw only once with perfect accuracy. Her voice was deep, almost male, and her laughter made even the dogs howl. She walked with a tilt, her right foot dragging. The household staff refused to touch her, claiming their fingers went numb afterward. Birds that perched near her windowsill died within days. Her tutors taught her astronomy, and she became obsessed with lunar charts, claiming she could hear the moon breathe. When asked what she meant, she said, "It hums when someone dies." She took to sleeping in the wine cellar, claiming the stone made her dreams softer. At 13, she carved hundreds of names into the stone walls of the cellar. Most were family, but dozens were unknown. Years later, many matched the dead listed in plague registers. She died in her sleep at 17, her body rigid, her face turned toward the ceiling as if listening. In Wales, in the shadow of Caer Myrddin, there lived a girl called Eluned, daughter of a long-dead house that still clung to its fading banners and incestuous pride. Eluned was born on Samhain, with a veil over her face and 2 thumbs on each hand. Her mother claimed she was born between veils, and refused to let her walk on grass until her 6th birthday. Eluned's skin was pale as birch, her hair white from birth, and her eyes swirled with 2 colors, green and gold. She could speak by 2, but only in rhymes. She saw shadows where none should fall, and once claimed her nurse had a raven growing in her chest. When the nurse died weeks later, the household fell into panic. Eluned was kept indoors, her windows shuttered, her food blessed before each meal. She took to drawing maps off cities that didn't exist, mountains shaped like women's faces, rivers that flowed upward. At 9, she refused to wear shoes, stating the ground needed to hear her thoughts. Her father ordered her sent to a convent, but on the journey she vanished. The cart was found with its wheels frozen in place and the horses weeping blood. Eluned was never seen again. To this day, travelers near Kermurden speak of a pale girl in white, walking through the mists, her hands trailing in the heather. In Denmark, nestled in the fjords, where ice kissed the sea, and mist clung to the trees like ghosts, young Riki was born under the cry of a dying whale. Her parents, twin royals from rival branches, hid her from the world. She was born with a tail-like protrusion, webbed fingers and gills behind her ears. Doctors believed she would not survive a month. She lived for 17 years. Her skin was always moist, her joints double flexible, and her voice carried in a way that echoed even in still air. She had a connection to water no one could explain. Fish gathered at her feet when she stood at the dock, and she could dive longer than any man. Sailors called her Den Lille Sososter, the little sea sister. Some swore they saw her under the waves, eyes glowing, hair floating like seaweed. She could predict storms, often singing low dirges before lightning struck. At 14, she stopped eating anything but salt. At 16, she disappeared into the fjord during a full moon, leaving only a trail of lilies on the water. These daughters, scattered in tower, convent, and forest, were not errors of biology, but mirrors held to power. Their bodies told stories that history dared not write, of blood twisted by ambition, of dynasties willing to gamble children for crowns, of mothers who wept over cradles lined with silk and terror. They were the breath between prayers, the silence between chimes. They were not born wrong. They were born honest, and the world did not know what to do with that. Listen now. Close your eyes. Feel their presence between the cracks in stone, in the hush before a storm, in the silence that follows a lullaby. They were here. They are here. Always. In the frost-bitten mountains of Austria, in a castle built into the cliffside to repel invaders and forget the world below, there lived a girl named Adelaida. Her birth was marked by thunder in a cloudless sky and the death of every rooster in the village below. Her parents, both cousins and great-grandchildren of a now extinct imperial line, had prayed for a boy. Instead, they were given a child with no ears and skin so thin that her veins formed violet constellations across her body. She did not cry. She blinked once every few minutes. Her heart was located on the right side of her chest. The midwife refused to touch her twice. Adelaida was raised without mirrors, as her appearance startled even the dogs. Yet she was clever, mimicking voices with terrifying precision. By 5, she could repeat entire sermons after hearing them only once. Her fingers were unusually long, and she used them to trace invisible patterns on walls and people. It was said that if she touched your forehead, you would dream of ancestors you had never met. Her governess quit after waking up screaming 3 nights in a row, shouting names of dead emperors. Her hair grew only on the left side of her head. When asked why, she replied, "Only that side wants to remember." She wrote poems backward. In Latin, no one taught her. Her father once caught her speaking with her reflection not in fear, but in negotiation. She had created a game she played only at night, placing teeth under her pillow and waking with a small stone in its place. Where she found the teeth, no one knew. At 12, she stopped sleeping entirely. She wandered the halls at night humming a melody the guards described as older than prayer. They began to quit. The bishop came to bless the castle but left weeping and mute. One morning, Adelaida vanished, leaving only a small hole in the window pane shaped exactly like her silhouette. Below, a tree bloomed in winter for the first and only time. Across the sea, in the lowlands of Zealand, in a marshy manor where fog never lifted, the girl Jacqueline was born with 12 toes, no eyebrows, and a birthmark shaped like a chalice across her back. Her parents were half-siblings, remnants of a royal house that once ruled sea and soil. Jacqueline screamed not when she was hungry, but when someone told a lie. Her wails were so piercing, they shattered 3 windows during her baptism. At 5, she refused to enter the chapel, claiming the ceiling whispered guilt. Her drawings featured only spirals, eyes, and birds with human teeth. One visitor called her the child of consequence. She knew when people would fall ill, pointing silently days before. The steward dismissed her until he found her crouched beside his bed, murmuring a hymn in a language unknown. He died 2 days later of fever. At 8, Jacqueline began to sew dolls from moss and cloth, each one resembling someone in the household. When the dolls were placed in a circle, storms came. She built an altar in the marsh, from bones of frogs and feathers from her own pillow. One night she led her tutor into the swamp and returned alone. He was never found. Her mother insisted she be exorcised. During the rite, every candle in the chapel extinguished itself. The priest bled from the eyes. The rite was never completed. At 13, Jacqueline grew taller than any woman in the province. Her voice deepened, and she began to speak in third person, calling herself we. She was seen standing in the marsh with her arms raised to the sky. A flood followed. She drowned at 16. Her body was never recovered, but the water lilies in the swamp bloomed blood red for decades. Far to the south, in Oregon, where the sun painted the stones with gold and the wind told secrets to the olive trees, lived Estefania, the last heiress of a deeply inbred house. Her parents were first cousins, and their own parents had shared blood across 4 generations. Estefania was born beautiful, a rarity among such lines. But beauty, in her case, was illusion. Beneath her flawless skin were bones that fused in the womb, lungs that wheezed under the weight of breath, and eyes that saw too much. By 3, she asked questions no one dared answer. Where do thoughts go when you lie? If the soul has roots, who waters them? Her laughter came in bursts, then silence for hours. She would sit, unmoving, for days, staring at her hands as if waiting for them to move on their own. Her dreams were vivid, and she described them with precision. I saw my twin in a mirror, she said at 6. She screamed because I was still here. Estefania had no twin. She collected insects, keeping them in small glass boxes under her bed. None ever died. At 10, she was found sitting in the courtyard during a hailstorm, eyes closed, arms outstretched. I wanted to feel what the angels feel when they fall, she said. Her tutors were scholars, priests, and mystics, none of whom lasted more than a month. She corrected their Latin, quoted lost gospels, and recited dreams as if they were scripture. The local abbot declared her possessed by beauty, too pure to survive. At 14, she began to write letters to someone named Anna. No Anna existed. The letters described events that would later occur: a fire, a death, a betrayal. At 15, she disappeared for 3 days and returned with her hair entirely white. She claimed she had spoken with a mirror that didn't reflect. Her health declined thereafter. At 17, she stopped speaking. At 18, she died during the night. Her last act was to place a mirror beside her bed, facing the wall. When they turned it over, no reflection appeared. In the deep forests of Hungary, where wolves outnumbered men and the stars seemed closer than the earth, a girl named Rosa was born in the ruins of an abandoned fortress, repurposed by nobles desperate to preserve a name long forgotten by the world. She was the product of 3 generations of sibling unions. Her body was twisted on legs shorter than the other, a spine that coiled like ivy, and lips sealed shut by skin at birth. They cut her mouth open so she could eat. She never smiled. Her voice came slowly, raspy, and low, as if pulled from a well. She had a mark on her palm shaped like a crown. The villagers called her the Thorn Princess. Wolves followed her when she wandered, never attacking. She was never taught to read, but she wrote in ash across stone, drawing maps of stars no one had catalogued. She preferred night to day, often waking only when the sun set. Rasa built small towers from bones and candle wax, lighting them with sparks from her fingers. No one taught her fire. At 9, she was found asleep in the middle of a circle of wolves. At 11, she climbed the crumbling bell tower and rang it for the first time in a century. The sound deafened the oldest man in the village. At 13, she announced she would marry the moon. "He visits me each month, cloaked in cold," she said. When her parents tried to lock her in a room, she vanished. Her window was sealed, her door bolted. All that remained was a single footprint made of ash. The next full moon, howling was heard from the tower again. These daughters, marked by history as mistakes or curses, were in truth the final echoes of choices, made in rooms with velvet walls and blood-soaked contracts. They bore the burden of legacy, of blood too concentrated to survive the world it tried to rule. Their stories are not myths. They are warnings. They are lullabies sung in reverse. They are names whispered in sleep. And tonight, in the stillness that cradles your breath, they ask not for pity but remembrance. In the northern reaches of Brittany, where cliffs met the sea in a jagged chorus of wind and salt, there stood a monastery long abandoned by men, but never by whispers. In its coldest chamber, beneath a vaulted ceiling of soot-stained stone, a girl named Isabel was born. Her cry was not heard until 3 hours after her birth, and when it came, it shattered every candle in the hall. Her father and mother, uncle and niece, their marriage sanctioned in secret by a desperate bishop. Isabel's eyes were Miss Macedon sea green, the other the color of smoke. Her limbs moved independently, as though her thoughts hadn't reached them yet. Her skin never warmed, even under the midsummer sun. She refused to eat food unless it had been left in moonlight. At age 4, she composed a song no one taught here, a lullaby that caused dogs to whimper and bells to ring in empty towers. Her hair never grew past her shoulders, and when cut, it bled. Her voice was high and trembling, but she spoke like a dowager queen, her words too old for her age. When a nobleman came to marry her at 11, she stared into his eyes and said, "You will not live past snow." He fell into the sea during a storm that winter. Isabel claimed she had dreamed it, but not as a warning, as a promise. Her dreams became doctrine in her house. Her mother began recording them in a leather-bound tome. "Last night I watched my bones leave my body," Isabel said at 12. "They returned at dawn, covered in salt." She was feared, loved, obeyed. Birds crashed into her window at dusk, always dead. At 13, she painted a mural of a forest on her chamber wall, a forest that did not exist on any map. When asked where it was, she replied, "It grows after the last king dies." Her hands were cold as stone and burned those she touched. She could not be taught letters, yet wrote pages in alphabets unknown. Her cousin once read a passage aloud and went mute for life. On her 14th birthday, Isabel stood atop the cliffs and whispered into the wind. The sea below stilled for a day. Ships refused to sail. The bishop came again, this time to cleanse her. He lasted 5 minutes in her presence before fleeing, claiming her shadow moved without her. At 15, Isabel went blind, yet she continued to paint. Her final mural showed a woman made of stars, seated on a throne of bones. When asked who it was, Isabel said, "My daughter. She died that night." The mural bled ink for 3 days. In the hollow valleys of Transylvania, a child was born who never cried. Her name was Serena. Her parents were siblings, and their father had once married his own aunt. She came into the world with eyes already open and teeth already sharp. Her breath was sweet as flowers, but her presence made infants scream. Her blood, when drawn, was black. She never learned to walk, she floated. Serena refused to speak until she was 7. Her first words, "The door is open now." No one knew what she meant until the eldest servant died the next day in her sleep. Her hair grew only in braids, though no one braided it. She could be seen in 2 mirrors at once. Her reflection often looked away before she did. Her favorite game was to bury apples in the ground and wait until worms emerged. "They know what we forget," she said. Her laughter caused clocks to tick backwards. At 9, she wrote a will. It named no heirs, only debts. She did not own anything. She was said to sleep with her eyes open and her mouth stitched closed by thread she placed herself. When lightning struck the stables, Serena was seen smiling through the window. The priest who came to bless her room was blind by morning. She wore only black, and on Sundays she placed coins on her eyelids and lay still for hours. At 11, she whispered into her cousin's ear. He never spoke again. She said he had heard something meant for after death. Her mother tried to confine her to the cellar, but Serena was found in the orchard, staring at the sky. The cellar had remained locked. She disappeared at 13. In her bed was left a single black feather and a broken hourglass. In the Sicilian highlands, in a fortress that once housed emperors but now echoed with the wind's sigh, a girl was born beneath an eclipse. Her name was Ottavia. Her father was her mother's brother. Her birth was marked by silence and a swarm of moths that covered the walls for 3 days. Ottavia had 6 fingers on each hand, and skin so translucent one could read her veins like scripture. She did not blink for her first year. Her pupils were shaped like keys. She never learned to walk, but always arrived where she needed to be. Her toys arranged themselves. The walls of her chamber grew damp when she wept. At 5, she began to speak only in questions. Where do birds go to dream? If God watches, who watches him? Her questions became mantras to those who served her. At 7, Ottavia refused to eat unless the food was blessed by a mute. She wore veils at all times, claiming her face could cause remembrance too heavy to bear. Her nurse once saw her bare cheek and screamed until her voice failed. She was found with a poem carved into her chest written in Ottavia's hand. At 9, Ottavia asked for a coffin. She slept in it every night. It listens, she explained. She wrote books in languages no scholar could identify, and when burned, the ashes formed symbols that haunted the halls. At 10, she called lightning down from a clear sky, pointing at a raven. The raven burst midair. Her mother tried to drown her. The water turned to blood. Ottavia stood on the shore, dry. By 12, she walked only at night. Servants claimed her footsteps made no sound. At 13, she stopped speaking. At 14, she began writing names on scraps of skin, none of which belonged to her. No one knew where she got them. At 15, Ottavia stood on the tower's edge and whispered, "It is finished." She stepped forward. She vanished before she fell. Lightning split the sky, and every door in the fortress burst open. The furniture bled. The walls wept. Ottavia was never seen again. These daughters, Isabel, Serena, Ottavia, were not mistakes of marriage or accidents of power. They were the reflection of a world that folded its blood inwards, generation after generation, hoping to preserve glory while creating ghosts. Their lives were not lived. They were endured like curses carved into bone. Their presence lingered long after breath stopped. Not because they were monstrous, but because they were mirrors. Mirrors to those who made them. And like all mirrors, they could only reflect what stood before them. Pride, fear, control, and decay. Now, As you lie in stillness, remember this. Not all who are forgotten were silent. Not all who are strange were wrong. Some simply carried too much memory. And sometimes, memory is heavier than death. In a kingdom where the river sang louder than the church bells and the fog lingered low over cobblestone streets, there lived a girl named Amalot, whose ancestors had married cousin to cousin for 7 generations. Her lineage was traced like a knot, every turn folding back into itself, until the tree resembled a spiral more than a branch. Amalot's skin bore the pale hue of candle wax, and her bones ached when the moon was full. She did not smile, for her lips trembled without cause. Her left eye twitched whenever someone lied near her. She walked with a gait that skipped every 3rd step, as if avoiding ghosts no one else could see. Her mother was her father's half-sister. Their wedding had taken place during a lunar eclipse, which the local priests tried to silence by drowning their bells in wet cloth. When Amalot was born, she did not cry. Instead, she hummed. The melody was unfamiliar, not from any church, nor bard's tale. It made grown men uneasy, and old women weep. Her nanny refused to stay past dusk. Her shadow moved slower than her, she claimed. By the time Amalot turned 5, she had already memorized the names of every bone in the human body. Not from books, but from dreams. She said skeletons whispered to her in Latin. Her fingers were always cold, and plants she touched wilted within hours. Her hair never tangled, but strands of it were found wrapped around door handles, candles, and once, the throat of a dead bird on the altar. The bishop who baptized her later resigned. He never explained why. At age 7, Amalot began writing letters to people who had been dead for centuries. The ink she used shimmered oddly, and no one could find its source. When asked why she wrote them, she said, "Because they remember me." She spoke to portraits. They listened. Her family tolerated her strangeness as long as she remained quiet in public. But at age 10, she began appearing in places she hadn't entered. Once, her uncle locked her in the tower. Moments later, she was in the kitchen, eyes fixed on the boiling pot. "He shouldn't have done that," she whispered. And the uncle fell down the tower stairs that same night. Amalot claimed no involvement. Her fingers were clean. Her alibis airtight, but her smile, absent until then, returned briefly at his funeral. At 12, she refused to eat food prepared by anyone but herself. When asked why, she said, "The bloodline is thin enough, without poison." Her words disturbed the cook so deeply, he left the estate forever. Amalot's voice never raised above a whisper, yet she was always heard. At 13, she requested a room with no mirrors. "I don't want to see what isn't mine," she explained. Her reflection had begun to smile before she did. One day, a cousin visiting the estate entered her room and exited seconds later pale, mute, and trembling. He never returned. Amalot never mentioned him again. Her family believed she was a warning wrapped in silk. No suitors came. Not one. Not even the desperate ones. The rumor had spread beyond the rivers. Don't wed the girl with the storm behind her eyes. On her 14th birthday, the family hosted a feast. Amalot did not attend. Instead, she was seen walking the grounds alone, barefoot, trailing crimson behind her. Yet no wounds were found. That night, the chapel burned to the ground, and no one could find the bell. Only the chain remained, wrapped around Amalot's bedpost, like a necklace. No one asked how. They didn't want to know, but things were changing. In other kingdoms, whispers had grown into laws. Priests began forbidding the unions of blood. Scholars warned of the thinning. Chroniclers, once silent, started recording deformities and curses. And daughters, like Amalot girls, caught between reverence and dread, were suddenly being looked at with new eyes. Not as gifts, not as devils, but as proof. The evidence of power turned inward too long. These daughters were never meant to rule, yet they ruled the air of every room. They bent silence around them like cloaks. Their voices left residue. At 15, Amelot vanished. Her bed was made, her shoes dry, her books untouched, but her letters, hundreds of them, were gone. The only clue was a note left in her writing. I have gone where the bloodline ends. Do not follow. Her chamber grew cold and never warmed again. Guests reported hearing humming. Always the same melody. Always behind them. Never in front. Elsewhere in a mountain court, another girl emerged. Her name was Leon, and she was said to have the sight of 1,000 eyes, though her face bore only 2. Her mother and father were twin siblings. Their union, celebrated in secret, justified by their shared purity. Leon spoke at birth, her first sentence. It is not mine, but I carry it. She walked at 3 months. She wrote music at 6. The birds outside her window mimicked her compositions. She wore bells on her wrists and walked in circles for hours, claiming to unwind the thread. Her tutors quit one by one. She told them things she could not have known: affairs, sins, regrets. It leaks from your ears when you sleep, she told one. She began painting symbols on the walls of her chamber, symbols that later appeared in villages far away, carved into stone. Her blood, when exposed to sunlight, turned to vapor. The king forbade her from entering the chapel. She laughed. I was never outside it, she said. By 13, she claimed she had 3 souls. One waits, one watches, one weeps. Her father wept with her. Her mother drank to forget. Leon knew when people were about to die. She sent letters ahead of time. They always arrived the day of the funeral. She kept a journal written backward. When read in a mirror, it described events yet to come. Her dreams were full of bells and teeth. She feared neither fire nor death but silence. It watches too, she whispered. One night, the bells across the kingdom rang without wind. Leon was found in the courtyard, hands stained with ink, eyes rolled back. The ink matched her veins. She was placed in the cellar for a year. When the doors were finally opened, she was gone. Only the bells remained, still ringing. These royal daughters, Amelot, Leon, and so many others, were not myths. They were consequences with names, not witches, not saints, just girls, born of a system too proud to look beyond itself. They were memory incarnate, and in every step they took, they carried the weight of choice made centuries before they drew breath. And as we drift into sleep, let us not forget, what we hide in blood lives in the daughters, and blood remembers. In a tower overgrown with ivy, hidden from the public eye, there lived a girl named Yseldra, whose birth was announced by a flock of crows circling the bell tower for 3 days straight. Her bloodline was tangled even by medieval standards. Her mother was both niece and stepdaughter to her father. They claimed divine dreams had joined them, though their silence at the altar suggested otherwise. Yseldra was born during a thunderstorm that split a nearby oak in half. The midwife died the following week, claiming she'd seen her own face reflected in the newborn's eyes. From the moment she could walk, Yseldra avoided mirrors and cast no shadow on feast days. She often whispered to object spoons, candle wax, stone wall sand, received answers only she could hear. Her fingers were always stained with ash, though she never went near the hearth. At age 5, she constructed a full cathedral from bones she claimed to have found under her bed. When her mother asked where the bones came from, Yseldra replied, the ones who couldn't leave. No one searched further. At 7, she refused to eat meat, saying the animals spoke to her of their deaths. Her meals were boiled grains, white roots, and rainwater collected from the northern Eve. She grew pale and slight, but never fell ill, even during plagues that decimated the household staff. When questioned by monks, she recited entire passages of banned scripturous texts that had been burned a century before. She claimed they came to her in dreams, written on ceilings made of flame. By 9, she began sketching faces of people no one recognized, though months later, Visitors arrived whose likeness matched perfectly. She would watch them from the corridor, silent and still, mouthing their names before they spoke. Her father forbade her to speak during Mass, for her voice unsettled the clergy. "It echoes sideways," said one friar. Another wept openly when she sang. At 10, she walked into the crypt and fell asleep on her great-grandmother's tomb. When she woke, she said she wasn't ready to be forgotten. That same night, her grandmother died. Iseldra smiled gently and returned to her room. From then on, no one locked the crypt again. Her journal, written in a language no one could decipher, began growing on its own. Pages filled themselves when she slept. When the scribes examined it, they found names, thousands, most of them belonging to deceased noblewomen from remote lineages, some so obscure they were erased from history. Her father burned the journal. It reappeared under her pillow the next morning, unburned. At 12, she began stitching small dolls with features eerily specific: scars, missing teeth, clouded eye sand burying them in the orchard. No one dared unearth them. A falconer did once, and his eyes bled for 3 days. He never spoke again. When Iseldra turned 13, she refused to wear shoes. She said the ground needed to remember her. Her footprints left behind warmth, even in winter. Snow melted in her wake. She slept with stones under her pillow, claiming they whispered truths when the moon was high. One night she woke screaming, "The line is cracking!" That same week, her cousin was born with no eyes. Her aunt, who had insisted on marrying her brother to keep the pure line intact, vanished into the woods 3 months later. All they found was her wedding ring nailed to a tree. Iseldra never commented. At 14, Iseldra was summoned before the court for a potential betrothal to a foreign prince. The moment she entered the great hall, the prince fainted. He later confessed he'd seen her aging in reverse, her face shifting between child and crone. The alliance was cancelled. The king said nothing. Iseldra returned to her chamber, removed all her teeth, and placed them in a velvet box. When asked why, she said, "They belonged to another life." She grew more silent with each passing day. The birds began mimicking her coughs. The cats of the castle followed her steps precisely, tail to heel, forming a line behind her wherever she walked. It was during the great eclipse of that year that the bells rang by themselves again. Iseldra stood on the parapet, hands raised, murmuring the names of those forgotten by history. Witnesses claim the wind stopped for an hour. Candles would not stay lit. The castle dogs howled as if mourning. She fainted and slept for 3 days. Upon waking, she declared, "There are no more daughters after me." And indeed, in the years that followed, not a single female child was born in her bloodline. The midwives grew restless. The clergy called it divine punishment. The nobles whispered the truth. The line had eaten itself. What began as preservation had turned into a spiral with no end, and Iseldra was its final loop. But the daughters still existed. In books, in ruins, in stories that mothers dared not tell their children. They were both warnings and witnesses, not monsters, not curses, just echoes of choices made for power, control, and fear. They had seen too much, remembered too deeply. And though the line may have ended, the memory of what it wrought would live longer than crowns or crests. When people forgot their names, the wind carried them. When tombstones crumbled, their stories survived in cracked stone and misshapen lullabies. Iseldra lived to 20. No one saw her die. Her bed was empty, her box of teeth gone. But the orchard grew a single white tree where the dolls had been buried. It never bore fruit, just whispered in her voice every time the wind passed through. These were the daughters, not doomed, but burdened, not cursed, but conscious. And as we drift into sleep, let us remember sometimes the past does not rest in peace. Sometimes it watches and waits. In the final records kept within the ash-stained archives of the forgotten abbey, there remains one last entry, faded ink on rotting vellum, sealed by the ring of a queen who never bore a child. This entry does not name a daughter, nor does it speak of a castle or a kingdom. It speaks of silence, of what came after. The world moved on from the royal daughters of inbreeding, or so it thought. The line may have vanished from the charts and crests, but something lingered inherited not in blood, but in burden. Across distant valleys, in moss-choked villages, girls were born with songs they didn't learn, dreams they never asked for, and memories that came from places they had never been. They spoke of towers before they saw one. They wept when bells rang, though they didn't know why. In one town, a girl named Tilda wept for a sister she never had, night after night, whispering a name her mother never uttered. In another, a child stared at a fountain and said, "This is where they drowned her." The water froze that night, and the frogs stopped singing. No one told these children the stories. No one had to. They were the stories, the remnants, the echoes. In time, the dreams grew heavier. The girls wrote in languages not taught in monasteries. Some carved sigils into the stone floors beneath their beds. Others collected bones from animals and arranged them into shapes that matched no cross or crown. One girl awoke with her hair braided in the style of a queen who died 2 centuries prior. Another hummed the lullaby, once sung by Yseldra to her dolls beneath the orchard tree. These were not coincidences. They were continuations, for while the noble houses had erased the daughters, burned the ledgers, and salted the soil where the line ended, the memory had already scattered. Through ash, through wind, through whispers. Inbreeding did not just ruin bodies, it cracked something deeper. It allowed a distortion to fester a fold in the lineage of thought itself. The royal daughters had been shaped not just by blood, but by history's need to forget them. And history, when it tries too hard to forget, creates hauntings. The modern world offered new distractions. Cities, firelight, machines. But in the quiet corners of the world, you could still hear it. A lullaby in the wrong tongue. A child born with bones too light, eyes too old, shadows that stayed even when the candle was out. The daughters had no intention of returning. They never left. They became the stillness in rooms with no wind, the chill behind curtains, the reason some mirrors crack without cause. In museums, portraits of unnamed noblewomen were found crying. Paint flaked from their mouths in the shape of words no one could read. In the vaults beneath forgotten churches, boxes of teeth were discovered, each tooth engraved with a different date. All dates matched the deaths of girls, erased from family trees. The more the world tried to look away, the closer the memory came. A scholar once said, "Legacy is not always a blessing." He vanished the night before his book was published. Only one copy remained. Its pages smelled of rosewater and ash. The cover bore no title. Those who read it claimed it changed each time, sometimes a story, sometimes a confession, sometimes a prayer. Always, it ended the same, with the sound of a girl laughing, the kind of laugh that knows more than it should, the kind that never forgets. In a small valley, where no maps point anymore, there's said to be a tree that blooms in winter. No one planted it. No one can cut it down. Beneath it, the ground hums softly at dusk. And if you lie there, eyes closed, you'll hear them. The daughters, not angry, not vengeful, just present, watching, remembering, carrying the weight of choices they never made, of names they never chose, of love turned political, of blood turned prison. Inbreeding stole their futures, but not their truths. Those remained, in lullabies, in wind, in sleep. So as you drift now into rest, know that the past has not forgotten you, and neither have they. They do not knock, they do not scream, they simply wait, for silence, for stillness, for someone to remember them without fear. And when that moment comes, they are there not to haunt, but to witness. to cradle the old truths and whisper them into your dreams. This is not a curse. It is a reminder that history does not disappear. It deepens, and those who were lost are simply waiting to be seen.